Welcome, listeners, to a story that reaches across the ages, from the frozen mists of ancient legends to the quiet streets of the modern world. You are tuned into Anana's creation, and tonight, we begin a journey into the heart of darkness, into the story of a queen unlike any other. This is the tale of Hel, the terrifying ruler of the Norse underworld. But our story doesn't start in a realm of gods and monsters. It begins in a quiet, ordinary town, with a young woman who had no idea that a chilling destiny was waiting to claim her. Her name was Helena. Helena loved the predictable rhythm of her life in the sleepy town of Havenwood, nestled in the rolling hills of New England. She worked as a librarian, a curator of other people's stories, and found comfort in the quiet rustle of turning pages and the scent of old paper. Her world was small, safe, and meticulously organized. Mornings were for coffee and the crossword puzzle. Afternoons were for shelving books and helping patrons. Evenings were for her cat, mittens, and a classic black and white movie. It was a life painted in gentle, muted colors, and that's just how she liked it. But lately, a strange, unsettling color had begun to bleed into the edges of her peaceful world. It started with the cold, not the ordinary, biting chill of a New England autumn, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from within her own bones. She would be standing at the checkout desk, a warm sweater wrapped around her, and suddenly a frost would creep up her spine, so intense that her breath would mist in the air. Her coworker, a cheerful, talkative man named Ben, would joke about it. "Someone walk over your grave, Helena?" he'd ask with a laugh. She would force a smile, but the phrase always sent an unnerving shiver through her. Then came the shadows. She would catch them in her peripheral vision, fleeting, dark shapes that vanished the moment she turned to look. A flicker in a darkened hallway, a strange silhouette in a reflective window. She blamed it on a lack of sleep, on the long hours, and the flickering fluorescent lights of the library. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. It had to be. The dreams were the worst. They were always the same. She stood in a vast, gray, and silent cavern, shrouded in a thick, cold fog. There was no sun, no moon, no stars, only a faint, ethereal gloom that seemed to rise from the damp stone floor. Before her stood a massive, imposing throne, carved from what looked like bone and obsidian. And on the throne sat a figure, a woman whose presence was so powerful it felt like a physical weight on Helena's chest. She could never see the woman's face clearly. One half was always obscured by shadow, a shifting, inky blackness. But the other half was breathtakingly beautiful, with skin as pale as new-fallen snow and an expression of profound, soul-crushing sorrow. The woman never spoke, but Helena could feel her gaze, a gaze of ancient loneliness and absolute command. Every night, Helena would wake up just as the woman on the throne began to raise a single, pale hand, her heart pounding and her skin slick with a cold sweat. One Tuesday afternoon, the strange occurrences escalated from unsettling feelings to a concrete, terrifying event. Helena was in the library's archives, a dusty, rarely visited basement area filled with centuries of town records. She was searching for an old land deed for a local historian. The only light came from a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows that danced between the towering shelves. As she ran her fingers along the spines of the brittle, leather-bound books, she felt it again, that unnatural, piercing cold. It was stronger than ever before, seeping into the very marrow of her bones. She hugged herself, her teeth chattering. The light bulb above her began to flicker erratically. 1, 2, 3 times, before it went out completely, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. "Ben," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Did the power go out? Silence. The thick, oppressive silence of the underground. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, her fingers clumsy with cold. She found it and turned on the flashlight, its bright beam cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. She swept the light across the room. Nothing. Just endless rows of old books. A rat probably chewed through a wire, she told herself, her rational mind desperately trying to find a logical explanation. She decided to head back upstairs. As she turned, the beam of her phone's light fell upon a tall, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. It was an old, forgotten thing, its silvering tarnished and its gilded frame caked with decades of dust. Helena didn't remember ever seeing it before. She walked towards it curious. Wiping a patch of grime from its surface, she peered at her reflection. Her own face stared back, pale and wide-eyed in the flashlight's glare. But then something shifted. For a split second, her reflection changed. The face looking back at her was no longer just her own. One half of the face in the mirror seemed to decay before her eyes, the skin becoming sallow and gray, the eyes sinking into a dark, hollow socket. It was a face of death, of decay. The other half remained hers, but it was transformed into a vision of sorrowful, majestic beauty. It was the face from her dreams. Helena screamed, stumbling backward and dropping her phone. The light went out as it hit the concrete floor, and she was once again swallowed by the suffocating darkness. She scrambled on her hands and knees, terror giving her a frantic energy. Her hand found the phone. She grabbed it, her thumb frantically swiping to turn the light back on. When the beam finally sliced through the black, she aimed it, shaking, back at the mirror. Staring back at her was just her, Helena, pale, terrified, but completely and utterly normal. There was no decaying flesh, no ghostly queen, just her own reflection in a dusty, old mirror. She didn't wait for another explanation. She fled, up the creaking wooden stairs, through the silent halls of the library, not stopping until she burst through the front doors into the crisp, autumn air. She stood on the steps, gasping for breath, the rational part of her brain screaming that she had imagined it all, that stress was making her see things. But as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent shaking, she knew. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic and reason. What she had seen in that mirror wasn't a hallucination. It was a warning. Something ancient and powerful was stirring, and for some reason, it had its eyes fixed on her, Helena, the quiet librarian from Havenwood. Her simple, predictable life was over. The story of the queen of the underworld had begun. Panic is a wildfire in the mind, and Helena's was raging out of control. She ran the 6 blocks from the library to her small apartment, not once looking back, convinced that a creeping, shadowy cold was chasing her down the quiet streets of Havenwood. The rational part of her brain, the part that organized books by the Dewey Decimal System and paid bills on time, was screaming that she had suffered a panic attack, a vivid hallucination brought on by stress and low blood sugar. But the primal terror that gripped her heart knew better. What she had seen was real. She burst into her apartment, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the deadbolt, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to lock it. Her cat, Mittens, a fluffy ball of orange fur, trotted over and meowed, rubbing against her leg, oblivious to his owner's distress. She scooped him up, burying her face in his soft fur, seeking comfort in his familiar warmth. For a moment it worked. The solid, living presence of her cat was an anchor in the storm of her fear. "It was just a trick of the light, Mittens," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "An old, dirty mirror in a dark basement. That's all." She tried to force her evening back onto its normal, comforting track. She fed the cat. She put a kettle on for tea. She turned on the television, hoping the mindless chatter of a sitcom would drown out the fearful thoughts racing through her head. But the ordinary felt alien. The familiar rituals felt hollow. Every reflective surface became a source of anxiety. The black screen of the microwave, the glass on a picture frame, the polished surface of her kitchen table. She couldn't look at any of them directly. She sat on her sofa, a steaming mug of chamomile tea in her hands, and stared blankly at the television. But the cheerful laugh track seemed to mock her. The faces of the actors felt like masks, hiding something cold and sinister beneath. The deep, bone-chilling cold from the library basement was returning. It started in her feet, a creeping numbness that slowly worked its way up her legs. She pulled a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders, but it offered no warmth. This was a cold that blankets couldn't touch. Mittens, who had been purring contentedly on her lap, suddenly went rigid. His ears flattened, and a low, guttural hiss escaped his throat. He wasn't looking at Helena. He was staring intently at the far corner of the room, a corner steeped in shadow, where the living room met the short hallway to her bedroom. His back arched, for standing on end. "What is it, boy?" Helena whispered, her own fear returning with a vengeance. She followed his gaze. There was nothing there, just an empty corner. But as she stared, she thought she saw the shadows thicken, shift, as if something vast and unseen were drawing them together. Then came the sound, a faint, dry whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It seemed to come from everywhere, at once. It was a sibilant, insidious sound that slithered into her ears. It wasn't a word, not in any language she knew, but she understood its essence. It was a sound of immense age, of profound loss, and of absolute, unwavering authority. Helena shot up from the sofa, spilling hot tea on the floor. Mittens darted away, hiding under the armchair. "Who's there?" she shouted, the words feeling small and useless in the suddenly heavy atmosphere of her apartment. The whispering stopped. The shadows in the corner returned to normal. The unnatural cold receded slightly, leaving behind a clammy dampness in the air. She stood frozen for a long minute, her ears straining, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing. There was nothing. Was she truly losing her mind? She needed to talk to someone. She snatched her phone, her thumb hovering over Ben's contact information. What would she even say? "Hi, Ben. Sorry to bother you, but I saw a monster in the basement mirror, and now my cat is hissing at shadows and the walls are whispering." They would have her committed. He'd think she was crazy. She was starting to think she was crazy. She deleted the half-written text message and tossed the phone back onto the sofa. She was alone in this. Drawn by a morbid curiosity she couldn't explain, she walked over to the large window that overlooked the street. Condensation had formed on the inside of the glass, a testament to the strange, localized cold that had just filled the room. But it wasn't a random pattern of moisture. As she looked closer, her breath hitched in her throat. Intricate, feathery patterns of frost were crystallizing on the pane, spreading like delicate white ferns. But they weren't ferns. They were shapes, symbols. They looked like ancient runes, sharp and angular, the kind she had only ever seen in history books. And among the runes were other, more disturbing images etched in the frost: skeletal hands, hollow-eyed faces, and the unmistakable silhouette of a massive wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. Helena stared, mesmerized and horrified. This was not a hallucination. This was happening. It was real. The frost was tangible proof that something had been in her apartment, something cold and ancient that left its mark on the very air she breathed. A wave of anger, sharp and hot, suddenly cut through her fear. Who was doing this? Why? Her quiet, predictable life was being invaded, torn apart by these inexplicable terrors. She refused to be a victim in her own home. She wouldn't be driven mad by shadows and whispers. She needed answers. She went to her laptop and sat at her small desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She didn't even know what she was looking for at first. She typed in strange cold spots, auditory hallucinations, seeing faces in mirrors. The results were a useless jumble of paranormal enthusiast forums and articles on psychological disorders. Frustrated, she leaned back, closing her eyes, trying to focus on the one concrete image she had: the face in the mirror. One side, her own, twisted into a mask of regal beauty and sorrow. The other, a terrifying visage of death and decay. Half beautiful, half corpse. The image was burned into her memory. On a desperate whim, she typed a new search query: "Goddess half beautiful, half dead." The search engine returned results almost instantly. She clicked on the first link, a page about world mythology. And there it was. Her blood ran cold, colder than any supernatural frost. Staring back at her from the screen was an artist's rendering, an ancient woodcut illustration. It depicted a queen on a throne of bones. One side of her face was that of a beautiful woman. The other was the rotting face of a corpse. Beneath the image was a single, stark caption: Hel, the Norse queen of the Underworld, ruler of the dead who did not die a glorious death in battle. Daughter of the trickster god, Loki. Hel. The name echoed in the silent apartment. It felt both alien and terrifyingly familiar. It felt like a key turning in a lock deep within her own soul. The whispers, the cold, the face in the mirror, it all had a name. And as Helena stared at the ancient depiction of the terrifying goddess, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that her search for answers had only just begun. She wasn't going crazy. She was being haunted, or worse, she was being called. The name on the screen, Hel, was not an answer. It was the beginning of 1,000 new questions. Helena felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, the safe, solid ground of her reality crumbling away to reveal a dark, bottomless abyss of myth and madness. The world she knew, a world of science and logic, had no room for frost-etched runes or two-faced goddesses. Yet, the evidence was right in front of her, crystallized on her window pane and reflected in the terror of her own memory. Sleep was impossible. The night passed in a blur of frantic keystrokes and the blue glow of her laptop screen. She devoured information, falling down a rabbit hole of Norse mythology that was deeper and darker than she could have ever imagined. She, a librarian, had always viewed mythology as a collection of quaint stories, ancient tales to explain the thunder and the seasons. Now, she read with a desperate, personal hunger. These weren't just stories. They were clues. She learned of Loki, the sly god of mischief, a figure of chaos and cunning. And she read of his terrifying children, born to a giantess in a secret, cursed union. There was Jormungandr, the world serpent, so colossal he could encircle the entire realm of man. And there was Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to kill Odin, the Allfather, during the final days of Ragnarok. The image of the wolf etched in the frost on her window flashed in her mind. It wasn't just a wolf. It was the wolf. And then there was their sister, Hel, cast down into the deepest, darkest of the 9 realms by Odin himself, who feared the prophecy tied to Loki's children. He gave her dominion over the dead, but not the noble, warrior dead who feasted in Valhalla. No, Hel's domain was for the vast majority of souls, those who died of sickness, of old age, of accident, or in childbirth. Her realm, Helheim, was described as a place of eternal, bone-aching cold and shadow, surrounded by a river of ringing swords, its gates guarded by a monstrous, blood-stained hound. As she read, the pieces of her own horrifying experiences began to slot into place. The profound, unnatural cold that clung to her was the chill of Helheim. The whispering she heard was the murmuring of the countless, silent dead. The dual-faced goddess in her dreams, and in the mirror was the queen of that desolate realm, her beautiful side perhaps representing the peace of final rest, and her decaying side representing the grim, inevitable reality of death and decay. Every word she read was another thread, weaving a tapestry of terror that seemed to be wrapping itself tightly around her own life. The first rays of dawn crept through her window, illuminating the frost runes before they melted away into harmless droplets of water. Helena hadn't slept a second. She felt hollowed out, her mind buzzing with ancient gods and grim prophecies. The thought of going to work, of smiling at patrons and recommending the latest bestseller, felt absurd. How could she pretend to live in the normal world when she had spent the night staring into the abyss? But what was the alternative? To stay home? To hide under her blankets while the whispers grew louder and the cold seeped deeper? No. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with a librarian's most powerful instinct, the need to know. The source of it all was in the library basement. The mirror. It had been the catalyst, the doorway through which this ancient horror had stepped into her life. She had to go back. She arrived at the library an hour before it opened, using her staff key to let herself in. The familiar building felt different in the early morning silence. The rows of bookshelves seemed like silent, watchful sentinels. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, to hide something in its depths. She found Ben in the break room, pouring himself a coffee. "Whoa, Helena," he said, his eyebrows shooting up. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Just a rough night," she mumbled, avoiding his eyes as she poured herself a coffee she didn't want. Her hand was shaking. "If you say so," Ben said, his cheerful tone softening with concern. "Listen, about the basement, the power was fine. I checked the breaker box yesterday after you left. Nothing was tripped. Kind of weird." "Huh? Yeah," Helena said, her throat tight. "Weird." She knew she couldn't put it off. With a deep breath, she descended the creaking wooden stairs back into the archives. She flicked the light switch, and this time, the single bare bulb buzzed to life, casting the same unsettling shadows as before. The air was still and musty, but the terrifying, supernatural cold was gone. For now, her heart hammering, she walked to the far wall where the ornate mirror stood. In the steady light of the bulb, it looked less menacing. It was just an old, dusty antique. She could see her reflection clearly now, a tired, pale woman with dark circles under her eyes. There was no monster staring back. She ran her hand along the gilded frame, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of vines and strange, coiling beasts. It was beautiful in a grim, gothic way. Where had it come from? The library kept meticulous records of every item it had ever acquired, from books to furniture. If she could find out the mirror's history, maybe she could find a clue. She spent the next hour poring over old, leather-bound acquisition ledgers. Most entries were mundane. 12 volumes of Encyclopedia Britannica, donated by the mayor's office, 1952. Oak reading table, purchased from estate sale, 1968. She was about to give up when she found it, tucked away in a dusty ledger from the late 1800s, when the library was first built. The handwriting was a looping, elegant cursive, faded but still legible. Item: ornate gilded mirror. Acquisition: donated, 1893. Donor: Mr. Elias Vinter. Vinter. The name was Scandinavian. A flicker of something, recognition, intuition, sparkled in her mind. But it was the note scribbled in the margin by the librarian of the time that made her blood freeze. The note read, Mr. Vinter was most insistent the mirror be kept in the archives, away from the public. He called it a window to a quiet place, and warned that some are not meant to look through it. He seemed a deeply troubled man, spoke often of the old country and the biting cold. Beneath that, in a different, shakier hand, was another note, dated 20 years later, in 1913. The head librarian, Mr. Abernathy, has been complaining of drafts in the archives for weeks. He speaks of whispers and nightmares. His health is failing rapidly. He spends far too much time downstairs near the Vinter mirror. Helena stared at the ledger, her mind racing. It wasn't just her. She wasn't the first. 100 years ago, another librarian, Mr. Abernathy, had experienced the same things. The cold, the whispers, the nightmares, and it was all connected to this mirror, donated by a mysterious Scandinavian man who spoke of a biting cold. She wasn't going crazy. This was a pattern. This was a history. The mirror wasn't just a mirror. It was a conduit, a connection to somewhere else. And for over a century, it had been sitting here, in the quiet darkness beneath the Havenwood Library, waiting for someone to look through. The faded cursive in the old ledger was a terrifying vindication. Helena was not losing her mind. A century ago, a man named Abernathy had walked these same dusty floors, felt the same unnatural chill, and been tormented by the same whispers that now haunted her. The mirror was a nexus, a source of this cold, dark energy, and it had been waiting patiently in the dark for over 100 years. And its story began with one Elias Vinter. The name echoed in her mind, a key to the entire mystery. Who is this troubled man from the old country? Why did he bring such a cursed object to a quiet New England town? And what did he mean by a window to a quiet place? Helheim was many things, according to the myths, but quiet was not the word she would use to describe a realm of the dead. Her fear, while still a constant companion, was now sharpened by a librarian's resolve. She had a lead, a name, and a date. Armed with this, she could do what she did best: research. She left the ledger open on the archive table, a silent testament to her sanity, and went to the main floor. The library was open now, and the familiar daytime sounds of patrons browsing and children laughing in the reading corner should have been comforting. Instead, they felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a dark, freezing lake. She began her search for Elias Vinter. Using the library's extensive town archives, she cross-referenced the name with census records, property deeds, and old newspapers' microfiche. For hours, she found nothing. It was as if the man had been a ghost, leaving only the mirror behind as proof of his existence. He wasn't in the 1890 census. There was no death certificate on file. No business registered to his name. As she scrolled through a digitized copy of the Havenwood Gazette from 1893, a strange feeling washed over her. The temperature in her small, enclosed office began to plummet. The familiar, bone-deep cold returned, more aggressive this time. The screen of her computer flickered. A low humming sound filled the room, vibrating through the floor and upper chair. She looked at the single light bulb on her ceiling. It was pulsing faintly, dimming and brightening in a slow, rhythmic beat, like a dying heart. "Stop it," she whispered into the cold air. "Leave me alone." In response, a book on the shelf behind her suddenly shot out, as if pushed by an invisible hand. It tumbled through the air and landed on the floor with a loud, definitive thud. Helena jumped, a small scream escaping her lips. She spun around, staring at the book. It was a collection of Robert Frost poems. Its title, stark on the cover, was A Witness Tree. The message felt chillingly deliberate. She was a witness. Her hands trembling, she turned back to the computer screen. She had to focus. She couldn't let it, or her, scare her away from the truth. She narrowed her search, looking not for Vinta himself, but for any large property transactions on the outskirts of town around the year 1893. If he was a recluse, he wouldn't have lived in the town center. After another hour of tense, chilling silence, she found it. A deed of sale for a 100-acre plot of forested land 3 miles north of town, known locally as Black Creek Woods. The land, previously owned by the town, was sold in 1892 to one Elias Vinter for a nominal fee. The notes in the margin of the deed were sparse, mentioning only that the land was considered unsuitable for farming or settlement. There was an old, hand-drawn map attached to the deed. It showed the rough outline of the property and, near its center, a small, hand-drawn square marked with a single word: homestead. He had lived there, away from everyone, deep in the woods, on a piece of land nobody else wanted. The place where he kept the mirror before bringing it to the library. A new thought, sharp and electrifying, struck her. He didn't just donate the mirror. He got rid of it. He brought it to the library, a place of knowledge and records, and insisted it be kept in the basement, out of sight. Why? Was he trying to contain it? Or was he trying to pass the curse on to someone else? The questions swirled, unanswered and menacing. The archives had given her all they could. The trail of paper and ink ended here, at this faded map. The rest of the story, the truth of Elias Vinter and his window, was not in a book. It was out there, on that plot of land, in the dark woods north of town. As dusk began to settle outside, casting long shadows across the library floor, Helena made a decision. Hiding was not an option. Waiting for the whispers and the cold to find her again in her apartment was unthinkable. She needed to be proactive. She had to go to the source. She printed a copy of the old map. At her apartment, she changed out of her work clothes and into sturdy jeans and hiking boots. She grabbed a powerful flashlight, her car keys, and a thick jacket. As she was about to leave, she hesitated. This was insane. She was a librarian, not an explorer, not a ghost hunter. She was chasing a century-old mystery based on a hallucination and a few cryptic notes. But then, she felt a faint, cold draft slip from under her front door. She heard a faint, dry whisper from the hallway, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across a lonely road. It sounded like a name. Her name. That was all the confirmation she needed. Staying here was not safety. It was waiting for the trap to spring. With a surge of adrenaline that was part terror, part determination, she opened the door and stepped out into the twilight. She didn't know what she would find at the old Vinna homestead. The ruins of a cabin? An overgrown field? Or something much, much worse? All she knew was that she could no longer wait for the shadows to come to her. She had to walk into them herself. The paved town roads gave way to gravel, and then to a rutted dirt track that was little more than a memory of a path. Helena's small sedan bumped and scraped along, its headlights cutting a nervous tunnel through the encroaching darkness. The dense, black silhouettes of the trees of Black Creek Woods pressed in on either side, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the twilight sky. The map on her passenger seat was almost a century old, and she could only hope the landmarks hadn't been completely erased by time. She parked where the track became impassable, the engine's dying rumble swallowed by an immediate, profound silence. When she stepped out of the car, the air was cold and sharp. This was a natural autumn chill, not the supernatural frost that had been haunting her, and the difference was a small, fleeting relief. She locked the car, the electronic chirp sounding unnaturally loud in the vast quiet of the woods. Flashlight in hand, she consulted the map. The homestead was marked about a mile in, near a fork in the creek that gave the woods their name. She found a faint trail leading into the trees and, with a deep, unsteadying breath, she stepped off the path and into the wilderness. The woods were a different world at night. The beam of her flashlight seemed small and inadequate, illuminating a small circle of mossy ground and tree trunks while making the surrounding darkness seem even deeper and more absolute. Every snap of a twig under her boots sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of leaves in the undergrowth could be some nocturnal animal, or it could be something else. The feeling of being watched returned, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that made her spin around again and again, sweeping her light through the impenetrable wall of trees. There was never anything there. As she walked deeper, the natural cold began to change. It was a subtle shift at first, a sharpening of the air, an edge that was too keen for a simple autumn night. Then, the familiar, bone-deep chill began to seep into her, a cold that her jacket was powerless against. It was with her. It had followed her here. A new sound joined the rustling of leaves and the pounding of her own heart. A low whisper, carried on the cold wind that snaked through the trees. This time it was clearer, a single word repeated over and over, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was an ancient word, guttural and strange, a word she had never heard but understood on a primal level. It meant daughter. "I'm not your daughter," she said aloud, her voice a defiant tremor in the oppressive dark. The whispering stopped, but the cold intensified. Her flashlight began to flicker. "No, no, no," she muttered, smacking the heavy plastic casing with the palm of her hand. The beam steadied for a moment, then died completely, plunging her into absolute, disorienting blackness. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was alone, lost in the dark, miles from anywhere, and she was being hunted. She fumbled in her pockets, her fingers closing around the small, reassuring shape of her phone. She pulled it out, its screen flaring to life, a small beacon of light in the overwhelming dark. Using its weaker flashlight, she swept the area, and then she saw it. Through a gap in the trees, not 30 yards away, stood the silhouette of a crumbling stone chimney, stark and black against the slightly less black night sky. She had found it. She scrambled through the undergrowth, branches scratching at her face and hands, until she emerged into a small, natural clearing. In the center were the ruins of the homestead. It was little more than a foundation of moss-covered fieldstones, outlining the shape of a small, long-vanished cabin. The great stone chimney stood like a tombstone marking the grave of a forgotten life. The air here was thick with a palpable sense of sorrow and despair. This had not been a happy home. She walked slowly around the foundation, her phone's light dancing over the rubble. What was she looking for? What could possibly have survived a century of rain and snow? Near the base of the chimney, she noticed a set of heavy, iron hinges bolted into the stone, nearly hidden by overgrown ivy. And next to them, a heavy iron ring.
A door.
A cellar door, set flat into the ground. Her heart leaped into her throat. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the ring with both hands and pulled. It was incredibly heavy, but with a groan of rusted metal and displaced earth, it began to lift. She propped the heavy stone and wood door open and aimed her light into the darkness below. A short flight of steep stone steps led down into a small, earth-walled root cellar. The air that rose up smelled of damp soil, decay, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood. Holding her breath, she descended the steps. The cellar was tiny, no more than 10 feet square. It was empty, save for a thick layer of dust and grime. Disappointment washed over her. There was nothing here, but as she turned to leave, her light caught a slight irregularity in the far earthen wall. A section of the packed dirt looked different, looser. She knelt and brushed the dirt away with her hands. Her fingers hit something hard and square. It was a metal box, an old, tin-tack ammunition box, heavy and sealed with rust. It took her several minutes to pry the lid open, her fingers raw and her nails caked with dirt. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like dried, rotted linen, was a single object, a leather-bound journal. It was miraculously preserved, the oil in the leather having protected it from the damp. Its pages were filled with the same elegant, looping cursive she had seen in the library's ledger, the Journal of Elias Vinter. She climbed out of the cellar, sat on the cold stone of the foundation, and opened the book. The first entry was dated 1892. "I have reached the New World," it began. "I have brought the curse of my family with me. The glass, the Hellspiel, is a burden I can no longer bear. In Norway, it hung in our family home for generations, a window into the gray realm, a relic of the old faith. They said it was a gift, a connection to the queen of the dishonored dead. They were fools. It is not a gift. It is a parasite." Helena's breath caught. Hellspiel, Hell's mirror. She skipped ahead, her eyes scanning the frantic, spidery script. "The cold is worse here. The land is younger, and the veil between worlds is thin. She whispers to me at night. She shows me images in the glass, her vast, silent kingdom, the pale, sorrowful faces of the dead. She is lonely. Her loneliness is an ocean, and she seeks to drown the living in it. She does not want to visit our world. She wants to claim it, one soul at a time. Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Her own experiences were a direct echo of this man's torment from over a century ago. She turned to the very last entry. The handwriting was jagged, almost illegible, the ink splotched as if the writer's hand was shaking violently. I cannot destroy it. I have tried. Fire does not touch it, and a hammer only cracks the glass before it heals itself. It is a part of her, and she is a part of it. I will hide it. I will give it to the keepers of stories, the librarians, and pray it becomes just another forgotten object in a dusty room. Perhaps without a Vinta air to anchor it, its power will fade. But I fear I am wrong. I fear it is not blood that calls to her. Helena read the final, terrifying lines, and all the air left her lungs. It is not blood she seeks. It is a likeness of spirit, a soul that knows true loneliness, a keeper of quiet places and silent stories. She seeks a warden for her realm, an anchor in the world of the living. She does not seek a servant. She seeks a successor. The final words of Elias Vinton's journal hung in the cold, dead air of the clearing. She seeks a successor. The phrase struck Helena with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. This was never just a haunting. It was an audition. All the strange, terrifying events of the past few days, the cold, the whispers, the visions, were not random attacks. They were tests. They were a calling. Hel, the lonely, terrifying queen of the dead, had looked through her window into the world of the living and, in a quiet librarian from Havenwood, she had seen a kindred spirit, a soul that knew true loneliness. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over Helena, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She scrambled up from the foundation, Vinta's journal clutched in a death grip in her hand. She had to get out of these woods, away from this place of sorrow and despair. She turned and ran, plunging back into the oppressive darkness of the forest, her phone's small light bouncing erratically ahead of her. The journey back to her car was a frantic, waking nightmare. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a tall, watching figure. The wind whispering through the pines sounded like her name, spoken in a voice of ancient, chilling command. The cold was no longer just around her. It was inside her, a shard of ice lodged deep in her soul. She could feel the goddess's presence now, not as a distant, haunting force, but as an intimate, suffocating pressure. She felt the weight of Hel's immense, eons-long loneliness, and she felt the terrifying pull of her will. The goddess was pleased. She had found a suitable candidate. When she finally burst out of the woods and saw the familiar, mundane shape of her car, she sobbed in relief. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking too violently to fit the key in the lock. She finally managed to get the door open and threw herself inside, slamming it shut and locking it, creating a fragile barrier of steel and glass between herself and the haunted woods. She sat there for a long time, her forehead resting against the cold steering wheel, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, Vinta's journal a cold, heavy weight on the passenger seat beside her. As the initial wave of terror subsided, a cold, clear thought cut through the panic. Elias Vinter had tried to run. He had crossed an ocean, hidden himself in the deepest woods he could find, and when that wasn't enough, he had tried to wall the mirror off in a library basement. And what had it accomplished? Nothing. The mirror, and the entity tied to it, had simply waited. It had waited a century, patiently, until another lonely soul came along. Helena realized with a dreadful certainty that she could not follow Vinter's path. She couldn't take the journal and the mirror, bury them in another cellar, and hope the curse would die with her. That wasn't a solution. It was merely a postponement. Hel would just wait again. For another 100 years, another 1,000, it didn't matter. For a being like her, time was meaningless. The cycle would only repeat. No. The only way to end this was to break the cycle. She couldn't hide from Hel. She couldn't outrun her. She had to confront her. The thought was so audacious, so impossible, that it almost made her laugh. She was Helena, the librarian. Her greatest conflicts involved patrons with overdue fines and the occasional paper jam. How could she possibly confront a goddess of death? Vinter, who had grown up with these legends, who knew the mirror for what it was, had been destroyed by it. What chance did she have? But as she drove the dark roads back to her apartment, the seed of an idea began to form. Vinta was a man of the 19th century. He was isolated, alone with his inherited terror and his folklore. But she was a woman of the 21st century. She had a world of information at her fingertips. She was a librarian. Her superpower was not strength or magic, it was knowledge. Back in the relative safety of her apartment, she locked the door, brewed the strongest coffee she could make, and sat down with her laptop. Vinta's journal lay open beside her. She knew the mythology now, but she needed more. She needed to understand how a myth could be real. She needed an expert, someone who treated these ancient stories not as dead history, but as something more. Her search was different now. She didn't type in Norse gods or Helheim. She typed in Norse Mythology Expert, paranormal folklore, historical basis for myths. She waded through academic papers, online forums, and university staff directories. She found dozens of scholars who could tell her the historical significance of the Eddas or the linguistic roots of the word Ragnarok. But that's not what she needed. She needed someone who was willing to look beyond the text, to entertain the possibility that the stories were more than just stories. After hours of searching, just as the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, she found him. His name was Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a retired professor of Northern European folklore from a small, prestigious university in Vermont. A quick search of his name brought up a series of articles and a handful of grainy, recorded lectures from a decade ago. He was a brilliant but controversial academic. His central theory, which had apparently marginalized him in the mainstream academic community, was that certain powerful, recurring myths were not just allegories, but were a kind of cultural memory, a record of humanity's interaction with non-human entities or alternate planes of existence. He called them resonant legends. Most of his work was dry and academic, but one article, published in a small, obscure journal of folklore, made Helena's heart stop. The article was titled "The Liminal Object: When Myth Creates a Doorway." In it, Dr. Finch argued that certain ancient artifacts, through generations of belief and ritual, could become permanently linked to the entities or concepts they were meant to represent, becoming a liminal object, a doorway between their world and ours. He described a handful of examples from history, and the last one was a theoretical case. Consider, he wrote, an object like a mirror, tied through ritual to the Norse Underworld of Helheim. To its owner, it would not be a mere object of superstition. It would be a source of profound, localized cold. It might induce auditory phenomena, whispers. Most dangerously, it would act as a scrying glass for the entity it is tied to, allowing it to seek out and influence receptive minds in our world. Helena felt as if she were reading her own diary. He knew. This man, this stranger, somehow knew exactly what was happening to her. He had described her reality perfectly. At the bottom of the article was a link to a simple, text-based blog that he apparently still maintained in his retirement. The most recent post was from 2 weeks ago. And at the very bottom of the page, beneath a long essay on the folkloric origins of the Krampus, was a simple, unadorned email address. Her hands trembled as she opened a new email. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her gut. But for the first time in days, it was joined by something else. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope. She was not alone anymore. There was someone else in the world who might understand, who might be able to help. She stared at the blank email, the cursor blinking patiently. Taking a deep breath, she began to type. "Dear Dr. Finch," she wrote, "my name is Helena, and I believe I have found one of your liminal objects. Hitting send on the email to Dr. Finch felt like leaping off a cliff into a dark, unknown ocean. For a moment, there was a sense of weightless relief, the feeling of having finally done something. But it was quickly followed by the cold, crushing anxiety of the fall. What if he didn't reply? What if he replied only to dismiss her as a delusional crank? What if he was just some old academic and his theories were nothing more than intellectual exercises? Helena was staking her sanity, and possibly her life, on the hope that a stranger she'd found on the internet was the one person in the world who could help. The next 24 hours were a unique form of torture. Every ping from her phone, every new email notification, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Each one was a disappointment. Junk mail, a notice from the power company, a weekly newsletter from a bookstore. The silence from Dr. Finch was deafening, leaving her alone in her apartment with nothing but her fear and the oppressive, watchful presence that now seemed to linger in every shadow. and the presence was changing. It was as if Hel could sense Helena's shift in strategy, her attempt to find an ally. The hauntings were no longer just about manifesting a general sense of dread. They were becoming personal. The cold would still come, but now it felt targeted, settling over her whenever she thought of her family or old friends. The whispers were no longer indistinct. She began to hear her own name, spoken in the disappointed tone her late mother used to use when she was a child. "Oh, Helena." The voice would sigh from the corner of the room, always so quiet, always hiding in your books. The reflections in her apartment became treacherous. It wasn't the monstrous face of Hel she saw anymore, but fleeting, distorted images of herself. She would catch a glimpse in the toaster and see herself looking 10 years older, her face etched with lines of deep, inconsolable sorrow. A reflection in a window would show her hunched and frail, the very picture of the lonely, forgotten old woman she sometimes feared she would become. Hel was no longer just trying to scare her. She was trying to break her, using Helena's own deepest insecurities as a weapon. She was reinforcing the central qualification for the role of successor: utter, complete loneliness. Going to work at the library the next day was an almost impossible task. She felt like a spy in her own life, pretending to be the same person she was a week ago, while secretly engaged in a war with a mythological being. "You're still looking rough," Ben commented, his brow furrowed with genuine concern as they sorted a cart of returned books. "You sure everything's okay?"
You seem jumpy.
"I'm fine, Ben. Just not sleeping well," she lied, her voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. As she spoke, she glanced at her reflection in the library's large glass entryway. For a split second, the image wavered. It wasn't her standing there next to Ben, but a tall, regal woman with pale skin and sorrowful eyes, one half of her face shrouded in shadow. The figure in the glass turned its head slowly and smiled, a cold, possessive smile that said, "You belong to me now." Helena gasped and stumbled back, dropping a stack of books. They hit the polished floor with a series of loud cracks that echoed through the quiet library. "Helena." Ben rushed to her side. "What is it? Are you going to faint?" "No, I tripped," she stammered, scrambling to pick up the books, her face burning with shame and fear. She couldn't do this. She couldn't maintain this facade. The cracks were showing, and soon, she was going to shatter completely. She was restocking shelves in the history section, her mind a million miles away, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. Her heart leaped. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she looked at the screen. It was an email. The sender was a Finch. She practically ran to the break room, locking the door behind her. She leaned against it, her heart pounding, and read the message. It was short and to the point. Subject: your liminal object. Dear Ms., I assume. Yours is the 17th email this year from someone claiming to have found a haunted object. The previous 16 were, without exception, cases of overactive imaginations, gas leaks, or outright hoaxes. I am a retired academic, not a ghost hunter. However, the term you used, Hellspiel, is not one I have ever published. It is a niche term from a handful of obscure Icelandic folktales. If you are serious, you will provide me with specifics. Do not tell me what you felt.
Tell me what you saw.
Describe the carvings on the mirror's frame in detail. Describe any runes you have seen etched in frost or shadow. Transcribe their shapes exactly. If you hear whispers, I need more than whispers. I need phonetics, cadence, language if you can discern it. I require data, not anecdotes. If you can provide this, I will listen. If not, I wish you the best of luck with your situation. Sincerely, Dr. Alistair Finch. Helena read the email 3 times. It was brusque, dismissive, and demanding, and it was the most hopeful thing she had ever read. He wasn't shutting her down. He was challenging her. He was giving her a chance to prove she wasn't crazy. He had given her a set of instructions, a mission, but the data he wanted, she didn't have it. She had been too panicked to study the frame of the mirror in detail. The runes on her window had melted before she could do more than glance at them. The whispers were fleeting and indistinct. To get what he needed, she would have to go back to the source, back to the basement. She would have to stand before that terrible window, the Hellspiel, and not run. She would have to look, listen, and observe, all while the entity on the other side was trying to claim her mind. That evening, long after the last patron had left and Ben had wished her a good night, Helena stood alone in the silent, darkened library. The only light was the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Vinta's journal was in her bag, and Finch's email was on her phone's screen. For 100 years, the mirror had been the aggressor. Tonight, she would be the one to approach it. She would be the one asking the questions. She walked to the heavy oak door that led to the archives. She put her hand on the cool brass knob, her resolve hardening. She was no longer just a victim. She was a researcher, gathering data for the only person who might be able to help her. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open, revealing the dark, waiting staircase that led down into the cold. Each step down into the archives was a conscious act of rebellion against every self-preservation instinct she possessed. The air grew colder with each step, the familiar musty scent of old paper and dust being overtaken by the sterile, biting chill of a morgue. The single bare bulb on the ceiling flickered as she reached the bottom of the stairs, as if in protest of her intrusion. This was its domain. She was an unwelcome guest. She walked slowly, deliberately, towards the far wall where the mirror stood. It seemed to loom larger in the gloom, its gilded frame absorbing the faint light rather than reflecting it. In her mind, she could hear the brusque, demanding tone of Dr. Finch's email, "I require data, not anecdotes." That phrase became her mantra, a shield against the rising tide of fear. She was not here as a victim. She was here as a researcher. She pulled out her phone, its screen a small, reassuring square of modern technology in this place of ancient dread. She opened the camera app, took a deep breath, and aimed its flashlight at the mirror's frame. "Okay, Elias," she whispered to the long-dead man who had started it all. "Let's see what you were so afraid of." She started at the bottom, forcing herself to focus on the details, to catalog them with a librarian's precision. The carvings were not just vines and beasts, as she had first thought. They were a story. At the base of the mirror, a great serpent with scales like polished obsidian was depicted, coiled and eating its own tail.
Jormungandr.
Her light traveled up the left side of the frame, where a monstrous wolf, its fur a maelstrom of carved lines, was shown straining against a thick, heavy chain, its jaws open in a silent, furious snarl. Fenrir. As her light moved, the carvings seemed to have a terrifying, subtle life of their own. She could have sworn the wolf's eye glinted, that the serpent's scales shifted. She took a series of sharp, clear photos, her thumb tapping the screen methodically. Data, not anecdotes. Then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, a sibilant hiss that seemed to leak from the very corners of the room. It was the sound she had heard before, but she fought the urge to cover her ears. Instead, she switched her phone to its voice memo app and hit record, holding it up like a talisman. "Hello," she said, her own voice sounding shockingly loud in the charged silence. "If you're going to talk, speak up." The challenge seemed to amuse the presence. The whispers grew louder, clearer, swirling around her. They were in that strange, guttural language, but laced within the alien sounds were words in English, spoken in a chorus of disembodied voices, preying on the fears she had been battling all week. So alone. A man's voice rasped, "No one is coming." A woman's voice sighed, "Your books can't save you." A child's voice giggled, a sound of pure malice. Helena gritted her teeth, her knuckles white as she gripped her phone. She focused on the Norse words, the ones she didn't understand. There was one word, repeated over and over, a rhythmic, tolling sound. Jalabru, Jalabru, Jalabru. She didn't know what it meant, but she hoped the recording would capture it. Finally, she forced herself to look into the glass. Her own reflection stared back, pale and taut with fear. But as she held her gaze, the reflection of the basement behind her began to waver, like a heat haze rising from asphalt. The towering shelves of books dissolved into gray, swirling mist. The stone walls melted away, replaced by a vast, featureless plain of black rock under a perpetually sunless sky. The air in the archives, already cold, plunged to a deep, painful freeze. She could see her own breath misting, not in front of her, but within the mirror's world. She was looking into Helheim. It was a place of profound, silent misery. In the distance, pale, translucent figures, the shades of the dead, shuffled aimlessly across the grim landscape. There was no sound, no wind, only an eternal, crushing stillness. And far in the distance, rising from the mist, was the throne of bone and obsidian she knew from her nightmares. The figure on the throne was clearer now.
Hel.
Her beautiful side was a mask of majestic, heartbreaking sorrow. Her decaying side was a horror of exposed bone and withered flesh. She wasn't looking at the shuffling dead around her. Her gaze was fixed forward, piercing through the glass, through the dimensions, and directly into Helena. She didn't speak, but her thoughts, her will, flooded Helena's mind. It was a wave of pure emotion, more powerful than any spoken word. Loneliness, silence, order, eternity, and beneath it all, a cold, clear command. You are like me. You appreciate the quiet, the order. This kingdom is silent, and it is eternal. It is yours to rule. Join me. The pull was immense. It was a siren song for the lonely, a promise of an end to all the messy, painful struggles of life. A promise of peace, of silence, of control. Part of her, the part that had always felt disconnected, the part that preferred the company of books to people, yearned to accept. It would be so easy to just let go.
No.
She said the word aloud. It was a small, weak sound, but it was hers. She tore her eyes away from the mirror, breaking the connection. The vision shattered. The world of Helheim collapsed, and she was back in the dusty archives, the shelves of books standing solid and real around her. She was gasping for air, shivering uncontrollably, her body slick with cold sweat. She had what she needed. She turned and fled, not looking back, scrambling up the stairs and slamming the heavy oak door shut behind her, as if it could hold back a goddess. She leaned against it, her body shaking, and looked down at her phone, still clutched in her hand. The photos were there. The voice memo was there. It had a recording time of 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Her mission was a success. She took a few deep breaths, her heartbeat slowly returning to something resembling normal, and then, with a trembling finger, she pressed play on the audio file. At first, all she heard was static and the harsh, ragged sound of her own breathing. Then, the whispers started, faint and distorted. She could hear the ghostly English words, and beneath them, the rhythmic chanting of the Norse word, Jalabru. It was all there. It was the proof she needed for Dr. Finch. She was about to stop the recording when a new sound cut through the static. It was different from the others. There was no hiss, no echo. It was a single voice, a woman's voice, as clear and sharp as a shard of ice. It was regal, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. And it was speaking perfect English. "I see you, librarian," the voice said. "And I am not impressed with your research." The voice from the recording, calm, clear, and utterly contemptuous, severed the last thread of Helena's denial. She was not dealing with a ghost, a psychic impression, or some strange natural phenomenon. She was dealing with a conscious, ancient, and powerful intelligence. An intelligence that was watching her, listening to her, and judging her. The Hell Spiel was not just a window she was looking through. It was a window Hell was looking out of. The librarian was being observed by the specimen. The terror that followed this realization was a cold, sharp, and clarifying thing. The time for cautious research was over. The time for hiding and hoping was a luxury she no longer had. She scrambled from her spot on the floor, her mind working with a frantic, desperate clarity. She ran to her office, locked the door, and immediately began composing a new email to Dr. Finch. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She attached the series of high-resolution photos she had taken of the mirror's frame. She attached the 3.5-minute audio file. In the body of the email, she wrote, "Dr. Finch, here is the data you requested. The photos show the carvings. The audio file contains the whispers. The repeating Norse word sounds like Jalabru. I've spelled it phonetically as best I can. Listen to the very end of the recording. At the 3-minute and 38-second mark, listen to the last thing it says. Please, help me, Helena." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The email shot out into the ether, a digital message in a bottle sent from a rapidly sinking ship. Now, all she could do was wait. But waiting was no longer a passive activity. The atmosphere in the library had shifted. Before, the presence had been menacing but indirect. Now, it felt like the air itself was charged with a disdainful power. As Helena sat at her desk, staring at her screen, and willing a reply to appear, the lights in her office began to flicker in a steady, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't the random flickering of a bad connection. It was a deliberate, mocking beat. A book slid off a shelf across the room and landed softly on the carpet, as if placed there by an unseen hand. She looked up and saw it was the same book of Robert Frost poems from before. A moment later, the book next to it slid out and landed neatly on top of it. Then another and another. It was a slow, deliberate display of telekinetic power, a casual demonstration of force meant to communicate one simple thing. Your little efforts are meaningless. I can touch your world whenever I wish. Helena squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to watch. She focused on her breathing, on the solid feel of the chair beneath her. You are just a story, she whispered, her voice shaking.
A dead myth.
A forgotten god. A cold laugh seemed to fill the room, a sound that was not a sound, but a feeling of pure, chilling amusement that vibrated in her skull. The final, clear voice from the recording echoed in her mind, not from the phone, but from the air around her. Am I? She stayed locked in her office for the rest of the night, too terrified to move. Every creak of the old building, every shadow that moved in her peripheral vision was a new torment. She was a prisoner, and the warden was a goddess of death. It was nearly 4 a.m. when her email notification chimed. The sound was so sudden it made her cry out. It was from A. Finch. This message was very different from his first. The academic skepticism was gone, replaced by an electrifying urgency. Subject: Data received. Urgent action required. Helena, I have reviewed the materials. My God, what you have is not just a liminal object. It is a fully resonant gateway. The carvings are textbook, Jormungandr and Fenrir, Loki's other monstrous children, acting as symbolic guardians. Jalarbru is the bridge, roofed with shining gold, that the dead must cross to enter Helheim. That you can hear its name means the gate is not only open, but the bridge is being extended to you. This is an invitation of the most aggressive kind. But the audio file, Helena, what you have captured is what paranormal researchers refer to as a Class A electronic voice phenomenon. A direct, intelligent communication. I have spent 40 years studying these subjects, and I have only ever encountered such a thing in apocryphal 17th century texts. I never believed it was truly possible. You have done more than anger it. You have intrigued it. By treating it as a subject of research, you have engaged it in a way Elias Vinton never did. This is exceptionally dangerous. It is no longer just trying to lure you. It is actively weakening the barrier between its realm and your location. The phenomena will escalate rapidly from this point. You must leave that place immediately. Email is no longer secure. We cannot risk it monitoring our communications. You need to come here, to my home in Vermont. I believe I have certain countermeasures that may be of help, relics I have collected over the years. But you must come to them. Pack what you need for a few days. Take the journal. If possible, leave your phone and any other networked electronics behind. If you must take your phone, turn it completely off. Do not use GPS by a paper map. Pay for gas with cash. Do not go back to your apartment if you can avoid it. Most importantly, do not look in any mirrors or reflective surfaces. Treat every single one as if it were the Hellspiel itself. Cover the rearview mirror in your car. Come at once, Helena. We have very, very little time. Below the frantic text was a simple, hand-typed address in a small, rural town she had never heard of. Helena stared at the email, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs.
It was terrifying.
It was insane, and it was the only path forward. He believed her. He had a plan. She was no longer alone. She stood up, a new, desperate energy surging through her. She grabbed her bag, shoved Vinta's journal deep inside it, and walked out of her office. The books were still stacked neatly on the floor. The lights still pulsed with their slow, mocking rhythm. She didn't look back. She walked out of the library, the pre-dawn air cold and clean on her face. Her old life, the quiet, safe life of a librarian, was over. She was now on a quest, driving north into the unknown, to meet a reclusive scholar in a desperate race against a goddess of the dead. Driving away from Havenwood in the deep, pre-dawn indigo was like shedding a skin. Helena watched the familiar streetlights and sleeping houses of her town recede in her side mirror until they were swallowed by the darkness. With each passing mile, she felt the oppressive weight of the library, the archives, and the Hellspiel lesson, if only slightly. It was a false sense of security, she knew, but she clung to it. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was moving forward, not just reacting. Her first stop was an all-night gas station just off the interstate. The fluorescent lights of the convenience store felt harsh and surreal. Inside, she followed Dr. Finch's instructions to the letter. She bought a detailed road atlas of New England, a bottle of water, and a bag of pretzels, paying the sleepy-eyed cashier with cash from her wallet. The simple, analog transactions felt like a ritual, a deliberate disconnect from the networked world that Finch had warned her about. Back in her car, she performed the strangest act of all. She took off the light, silk scarf she was wearing, and carefully tied it over her rearview mirror, blinding it. It was a stark, physical admission that her world was no longer governed by the normal rules of reality. The simple act of checking for traffic behind her was now a life-threatening risk. Driving without a rearview mirror was disorienting, forcing her to rely on her side mirrors and quick glances over her shoulder, but the alternative was unthinkable. The sun rose as she crossed the state line, painting the autumn foliage on the rolling hills in brilliant shades of orange and red. It was beautiful, but Helena could find no joy in it. The world now seemed like a gallery of forbidden surfaces. She drove with a constant, humming anxiety, her eyes flitting away from anything that held a reflection. The polished chrome of a tanker truck ahead of her, the windows of a passing commuter train, a placid pond nestled in a valley, each was a potential window, a potential attack. She was a fugitive from her own reflection. As the miles wore on, a deep, wearying exhaustion set in. And with the exhaustion came a new form of assault. With the visual gateways of mirrors denied to her, Hel changed her tactics. The attack became auditory, and it became internal. It started with the car radio. She had left it off, but it suddenly crackled to life, emitting a low, static hiss. Through the static, she could hear a faint, melodic chanting, the song of a choir, but the tones were all wrong, mournful and dissonant. She quickly reached out and shut it off, her heart pounding. A few minutes later, it happened again. This time, she didn't just turn it off. She pulled the fuse for the radio from the box under the dashboard. But the voice didn't need the radio. It began to speak directly into her mind. It was the calm, regal voice from the recording, no longer contemptuous, but smooth, reasonable, and deeply persuasive. "This is foolish, librarian," it whispered in the quiet of her thoughts. "You are driving towards a stranger, a failed old man who hides from the world. What can he offer you? Protection? There is no protection from what you are. He will use you for his research, and when you are no longer useful, he will abandon you. You will be alone again. You're not real," Helena said through gritted teeth, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I am the only thing that has ever been real," the voice replied, its tone patient and serene. "I understand you. Elias Vintu understood you. This Dr. Finch, he does not. He sees a specimen. I see a partner, a queen. Why do you run from your own destiny? It is a kingdom I offer you, an escape from all the noise and pain of your short, fleeting life. Turn the car around, Helena. Come back to the quiet. Come home." The voice was a venomous honey, playing on every doubt, every insecurity she had ever felt. Was she just running toward another form of isolation? Was Finch just another lonely soul, clinging to his theories? The insidious logic of the voice began to eat at her resolve. Lost in this internal battle, her driving became automatic. Out of sheer, decades-old habit, her eyes flicked to the driver's side mirror to check her blind spot. For one horrifying, split second, she did not see the highway stretching out behind her. She saw a vast, gray plain shrouded in mist. She saw the pale, shuffling figures of the dead. She saw a throne of bone. The vision struck her with the force of a physical impact. She cried out and jerked the wheel, the car swerving violently over the rumble strip. A horn blared behind her as a truck roared past. She wrestled the car back into her lane, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. She pulled over onto the shoulder, her body shaking from the adrenaline. It took her a full 10 minutes to calm down. With shaking hands, she took the paper map from the passenger seat and tore off 2 large pieces, using the car's tape dispenser to plaster them over both of her side mirrors. Now she was truly driving blind. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was safer than the alternative. The rest of the drive passed in a blur of hypervigilance. As dusk fell, she finally exited the highway and followed the atlas onto the winding state roads of rural Vermont. The towns grew smaller. The forest grew thicker. The Green Mountains lived up to their name, their ancient, rolling presence feeling both peaceful and secretive. She found the town of Northwood Chapel, which was little more than a crossroads with a general store, a post office, and a white steepled church. Following the map, She turned onto a narrow, unpaved road marked with a simple wooden sign that read Finch. The driveway was long and tunneled by ancient maple trees, leading her deeper into the woods. At the end of it sat a house. It was an old, sturdy-looking salt box, its paint peeling but its structure solid, with a great stone chimney at its center. It was a house that looked like it had been built to withstand long, hard winters. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming plume in the deepening twilight. Helena pulled her car to a stop on the gravel patch in front of the house and killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute. For a moment, she just sat there, the enormity of her journey, of her entire situation, crashing down on her. She had fled her home, her job, her life, and driven hundreds of miles into the wilderness to meet a stranger, all because of a ghost in a mirror. As she watched, a warm, yellow light appeared in the front window. A moment later, the heavy wooden front door creaked open. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with a shock of unruly white hair. He held not an electric light, but an old-fashioned oil lamp, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows. He raised the lamp slightly, as if in greeting. Helena got out of the car, her legs stiff from the long, tense drive. The air in the Vermont woods was cold and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. The man in the doorway, Dr. Alistair Finch, was exactly as she had imagined and nothing like it. He was tall and gaunt, with a cascade of untamed white hair that gave him the look of a mad composer. But his eyes, even from a distance, were sharp and intensely focused. They were the eyes of a hawk, and they were fixed on her.
"Helena," he said.
His voice was a dry, raspy baritone, the sound of dusty lecture halls and late-night study. It was not a question. "Dr. Finch," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. "You made good time," he stated, stepping aside and holding the oil lamp up to light her way. "And you were not followed."
"Good. Come in. Quickly."
The night is a poor time for conversations on the doorstep. She hurried inside, and he shut the heavy oak door behind her, sliding a thick iron bolt into place. The sound was loud and final. For the first time in days, Helena felt a profound, if fleeting, sense of safety. The inside of the house was a revelation. It was not a home. It was a library, a museum, and a fortress all in one. Every single wall was covered, floor to ceiling, with bookshelves. They were crammed with everything from ancient, leather-bound tomes to modern paperbacks, all meticulously organized. Interspersed among the books were strange and fascinating objects: a Viking-era sword, pitted with age, mounted over a stone fireplace, framed maps of ancient Scandinavia, display cases containing runestones, fragments of pottery, and pieces of old, intricate jewelry. But what struck Helena the most was what wasn't there. There were no mirrors, not a single one. The windows were bare, with no curtains to create reflections in the dark glass. The television in the corner was an old, matte screen model, and even the glass on the display cases seemed to be made of a special, non-reflective material. This man didn't just have a theory, he lived it. "Tea?" he asked, already moving toward a small kitchen alcove. "I find a strong black tea is essential for discussing matters of theological trespass. Please sit." He gestured to one of two worn leather armchairs arranged before the crackling fire. Helena sank into the chair, the warmth from the hearth a welcome comfort against the deep, unnatural chill that had become her constant companion. She placed her bag on the floor beside her, the weight of Winter's journal a solid presence. Finch returned with two steaming mugs. He handed one to her and settled into the other chair, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," he said, his tone all business. "I have read your emails, studied your photographs, and listened to that recording more times than I care to admit. But I need to hear it from the beginning. Everything. From the first moment you felt the cold. Do not omit a single detail, no matter how insignificant it seems." And so, she told him. She spoke for nearly an hour, her voice growing stronger and more confident as she laid out the story that had been trapped in her own terrified mind. She told him about the library, the dreams, the face in the mirror, the whispers, the frost on her window. She pulled out Vinta's journal, and he took it with a reverent care, his long, thin fingers tracing the worn leather cover. As she spoke, he listened with an unnerving stillness, his eyes never blinking, interjecting only with sharp, clarifying questions. "The frost," he cut in at one point. "The runic shapes. Did you recognize any of them?" No, she said. They were just sharp, angular symbols. It would have been Algi's, the rune of protection, reversed, he murmured, more to himself than to her. A warding symbol, twisted into a beacon. Clever. When she finally finished, recounting the horrifying, crystal-clear voice on the recording, the room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Finch leaned forward, his expression grim. It is worse than I thought, he said. Elias Vinto did not just bring a cursed object to your town, Helena. He abdicated his family's sacred duty. He gestured around the room at the books and artifacts. These are not just stories. They are histories of a long and bloody war between our world and others. A war fought not with armies, but by wardens and watchers. The Vinter family, it would seem, were the wardens of the Hellspiel. Their bloodline, their connection to the old faith, acted as the lock on the gate. When Elias fled, he didn't just leave the gate behind. He left it unlocked. He stood and began to pace before the fire. This entity, this queen of the dead, is not a god in the way we think of them. She is a being of immense power, but she is bound by rules. Her influence is tied to her realm. She cannot simply step into our world. She needs a conduit, an anchor, a living soul, resonant with her own nature, to act as her agent. A successor, as Vintus so terrifyingly put it. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. She has been looking through that unlocked door for 100 years, Helena. Looking for someone with the right qualifications. Loneliness. A quiet life spent among the dead stories of others. An affinity for silence and order. She has been looking for you. The words, which she already knew to be true, felt devastatingly final when spoken by him. So, what do I do? She asked, her voice cracking. How do I fight her? We do not fight her, Finch said sternly. To fight her on her terms is to lose. We must re-establish the wards. We must lock the gate. And to do that, we must first protect the anchor. He walked over to a large, iron-bound chest in the corner of the room and unlocked it with an old, heavy key. She has established a connection to you. We must disrupt it. He reached into the chest and pulled out a small, simple object. It was a piece of dark, almost black wood, worn smooth with age, with a single, deeply carved symbol on it. It was a circle with a cross inside, the symbol of the sun. It was threaded onto a simple leather cord. Rowan wood, he said, his voice low, from a tree struck by lightning. In the old beliefs, it is a wood of immense protective power, a symbol of life and light, anathema to the cold and the dark of the underworld. The sun cross is one of the oldest wards against things that stir in the dark. He held it out to her. This will not save you, Helena, he said, his voice grave. It is not a magic bullet, but it is a shield. It will disrupt her direct line to you. It may dampen the whispers, lessen the cold. It will give us time to think. And more importantly, he added, his sharp eyes meeting hers, it will announce to her, in a language she understands, that you are no longer alone. Helena reached out, her fingers closing around the smooth, solid wood. It felt surprisingly warm to the touch. Helena took the amulet from Dr. Finch, her fingers closing around the smooth, warm wood. The simple object felt solid and real in a world that had become a nightmare of whispers and shadows. With a deep breath, she lifted the leather cord over her head and let the rowanwood suncross settle against her skin, just below her collarbone. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. For weeks, she had been living with a constant, low-frequency hum of dread in the back of her mind, a cold, watchful presence that was her constant companion. She had grown so used to it that she had almost forgotten what true silence felt like. The moment the amulet touched her, that connection was severed with the jarring finality of a cut power line. The unnatural chill that clung to her bones evaporated. The insidious mental pressure vanished. For the first time since she had looked into the Hellspiel, the only thoughts in her head were her own. The sudden, profound silence was so complete that it made her dizzy. She stumbled back a step, catching herself on the arm of the chair. I know, Finch said softly, his sharp eyes watching her with academic curiosity. The silence can be disorienting when you've grown accustomed to the parasite. You are, for the moment, shielded. You are invisible to her. He had barely finished his sentence when the world outside the windows erupted. A furious, violent wind slammed into the old house, seemingly out of nowhere. The wooden frame of the building groaned in protest. The windows rattled in their casements. The calm, crackling fire in the hearth suddenly roared, spitting embers out onto the stone as a powerful downdraft blasted through the chimney. It wasn't a natural wind. It was a physical manifestation of pure, unrestrained rage. A deep, rhythmic boom, boom, boom began to echo from the roof, as if a giant were pounding its fist against the shingles. Helena cried out in alarm, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" Finch, however, remained utterly calm. He took a slow sip of his tea, seemingly unperturbed by the supernatural hurricane trying to tear his house apart. "The parasite has been blinded," he explained, his voice even and steady over the roar of the wind. "The connection has been severed, so she can no longer attack you with precision. This is the equivalent of a toddler's tantrum. She is throwing her power not at you, but at this house and its wards, hoping to break through with brute force. It is impressive, but it is crude." He stood up, placing his mug carefully on the mantelpiece. "Still, it is always best to ensure the locks are holding." He moved through the room with a calm, practiced efficiency. He went to the front door, where a small, leather pouch hung from a nail. He took a pinch of what was inside, coarse salt, and sprinkled it in a thin, unbroken line across the threshold. "Salt is a symbol of purity and preservation," he explained, his voice carrying easily over the din. "It creates a barrier that spirits tied to decay find difficult to cross." Next, he checked the windows. In each sill, Helena now noticed a small, flat, gray stone, each etched with a different runic symbol. One of them, a shape like a capital M with an extra vertical line, looked vaguely familiar. "Iron-rich stones, each marked with a protective rune," Finch said, running a finger over one of the carvings. "This is Algi's, the rune of protection. Not reversed as she showed you, but in its proper orientation. These disrupt the flow of her energy, turning the windows from weak points into shields." The furious assault continued for nearly half an hour. The wind howled, the walls shook, and the rhythmic pounding continued, a relentless drumbeat of fury. Helena sat huddled in the armchair, the warm amulet clutched in her hand, watching in awe as Finch moved about his home, a scholar tending to his fortress. Finally, as suddenly as it began, the wind died. The pounding stopped. The fire returned to a gentle crackle. Silence, deep and profound, descended once more. Finch returned to his chair. "She has spent a great deal of energy for no result," he said with a grim satisfaction. "She will retreat for now to consolidate her power. But she will be back. The wards will hold, but they are not a permanent solution. Every time she attacks them, they weaken slightly. This house is a temporary sanctuary, not a final victory." He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Which brings us to the most important question. Now that we have a moment to breathe, what do we do next? We cannot hide here forever. But what can we do?" Helena asked, her voice trembling. Vinta ran, and it didn't work. He hid the mirror, and it just waited. "Precisely," Finch exclaimed, a flicker of academic excitement in his eyes. Vinta's strategy was flawed. He treated the symptom, not the disease. He tried to hide the gate, but he never tried to lock it. That is what we must do. He picked up Vinta's journal, which he had placed on the table between them, and opened it to the first page. He writes here, "In Norway, it hung in our family home for generations. They said it was a gift. This is our most important clue. The mirror did not become a gateway on its own. It was likely consecrated as one by Vinter's ancestors, who acted as its keepers. They must have had a method for controlling it, for sealing it, a key for the lock they created." He looked up at Helena, his eyes burning with intensity. "Vinta couldn't destroy it. I suspect we can't either. But we can lock it. We can perform the ritual, speak the words, or find the object that will render it inert, turning it back into a simple piece of silvered glass. But the knowledge of how to do that, the key, is not here in America." A new, terrifying, and audacious idea began to dawn in Helena's mind as she followed his logic to its inevitable conclusion. "The key," Finch said, his voice dropping to a low, determined whisper, "is in Norway, in the ruins of the Vinter family home. We cannot win this war by defending. We must go on the attack. We must take the fight to the source." He closed the journal and looked at her, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Our research is done, Helena. Now our pilgrimage begins." The silence that followed Dr. Finch's declaration was heavier than the supernatural assault that had preceded it. Norway, The word hung in the air of the small, book-lined room, seeming both absurd and absolutely necessary. Helena looked from the old scholar's intense, determined face to the simple wooden amulet in her hand, and then to the journal on the table, the last testament of a man who had fled an ocean away, only to find it wasn't far enough. Norway, she repeated, the word feeling foreign and clumsy on her tongue. How would we even begin? We don't know where to look. And how are we supposed to get on a plane when I can't even look in a car's side mirror without seeing things? Finch nodded, his expression grim but practical. These are the correct questions to be asking. The how is the problem we must now solve. The why is already established. We have entered the eye of the storm, Helena. We have a brief, temporary peace. We must use it to plan our next move with absolute precision. He retrieved Vinta's journal and opened it on the large wooden table between them, its pages yellowed and brittle under the warm lamplight. First, the location. Vinta was a man in distress, not a careful historian. He mentions his family home, but gives no town. We must hunt for clues. For the next several hours, they worked. It was a task Helena was uniquely suited for. The terror receded, replaced by the familiar, comforting focus of research. She and Finch pored over the journal's pages, not for its story of horror, but for its incidental details. Finch, with his encyclopedic knowledge of Scandinavian history and geography, was the perfect partner. A passing mention of the Long Water, where Vinta learned to sail as a boy, had Finch pulling out ancient maritime charts. He doesn't call it a fjord, Finch mused, tracing a line with his finger. He uses an older term. He could be referring to Sonefjord, the longest in Norway. Later, Helena found a name scrawled in a margin, almost an afterthought in a passage about Vinta's childhood loneliness. The name was Solvern. Solvern. Finch breathed, his eyes lighting up. He moved to a massive bookshelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound atlas of 19th century European parishes. He flipped through the pages, his long fingers scanning the dense text. Here, he said, tapping a point on a detailed map of the Sonefjord region. A tiny village right on the coast. It's known for its ancient stave church, a place steeped in the old ways. It's a strong possibility. They had a destination, a fragile, tentative pin on a map an ocean away. Which brings us to your second point, Finch continued, steepling his fingers. Travel. You are correct. A modern airport is a minefield of reflective surfaces. Security screens, polished floors, vast panes of glass. It is out of the question. He paused, a thoughtful look on his face. But there are older ways to cross the ocean. Slower ways. A cargo ship, perhaps. It would be Spartan but functional. Far fewer mirrors and far fewer people. Amidst the intense planning, a quiet moment fell. Helena looked at the man across from her, a stranger who had unhesitatingly opened his home and his life to her. Why are you doing this, Dr. Finch? She asked softly. You could have just ignored my email. Finch's sharp gaze seemed to soften for a moment. He looked into the fire, his expression distant. When I was a young, arrogant academic at university, I had a mentor, Professor Eklund. He was the one who first proposed the theory of resonant legends. Everyone else thought he was a crackpot, but I was fascinated. He told me stories of his own research, of an artifact he was tracking, a set of old ceremonial bells from a forgotten Germanic tribe. He believed they were a liminal object. Finch fell silent, his face grim. He went on a research trip to the Black Forest in Germany to find them. He never came back. The official report said he got lost and died of exposure. But his last letter to me spoke of hearing faint, discordant chimes in the woods, and of a profound silence that was taking root in his mind. He looked at Helena, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. I dismissed it as poetic language. I was a fool. I have spent the last 30 years of my life trying to understand what I was too blind to see then. I am doing this, Helena, because I will not make the same mistake twice. The confession hung in the air between them, forging a bond stronger than any simple alliance. They were not just a scholar and a librarian. They were two people fighting for a second chance. There is one last problem, Finch said, his voice returning to its practical tone. The Hellspiel itself. We cannot take it with us. It's a beacon. But we cannot leave it in the library, unprotected. It has found you once. It could find another lonely soul. It is a loaded pistol left on a playground. So what do we do? Helena asked, dreading the answer she already knew was coming. We cannot lock it from here. but we can put it in a box, he said. Metaphorically. We must create a warding powerful enough to contain its influence for a time. A seal. It will require iron, salt, and rowan wood, all prepared with the proper rites. It will also require you. Helena felt a chill that had nothing to do with Hel. Me? Yes, Finch said gravely. The mirror is attuned to you.
You are part of the equation now.
The warding must be enacted by the one the mirror has chosen. It will be your will against hers. The amulet will protect you, but it will be a fight. To begin our journey to Norway, we must first return to its source. We have to go back to Havenwood. The thought of descending those stairs again, of standing before that mirror, filled her with a familiar terror.
But it was different now.
Before, she was a victim. Now, she would be a warrior. A warden. Okay, Helena said, her voice quiet but firm, surprising even herself with its resolve. Let's go back to the library. One last time. The decision, once made, settled into a cold, hard resolve in Helena's gut. The quiet sanctuary of Dr. Finch's home, which had seemed like the only safe harbor in the world, now felt like a temporary truce room. The real war had to be fought on the battlefield, and the battlefield was waiting for her back in Havenwood. They spent the next day preparing, not for a journey, but for a mission. Finch was transformed from a reclusive scholar into a meticulous quartermaster, assembling the components for the warding ritual with the focused intensity of a soldier preparing his gear. He laid everything out on his large wooden table, explaining the significance of each item. This is not magic in a way most people think of it, he explained, holding up a heavy, black nail. It was crudely made, its surface uneven. This is cold-forged iron, beaten into shape without the use of a forge's fire. In the Old Norse world, the spirits of Helheim are creatures of cold and decay. The pure, fiery energy of the forge is something they can understand, even resist. But cold iron, this is the stuff of the living earth, shaped by pure physical will. It is anathema to them. It confuses and repels their essence. He added 4 of the nails to a canvas bag. Next came a pouch of coarse sea salt, a bundle of dried rowan twigs bound with red thread, and a block of chalk. The chalk is mixed with powdered iron and silver, Finch said. Silver for its purity, and iron for its properties of repulsion. You will use it to draw the seal. He then unrolled a piece of parchment, its surface covered in his own precise, academic script and detailed drawings. It was a step-by-step diagram of the ritual. The containment ward is a complex one. It requires 4 points of focus, the iron nails, to create a perimeter. The salt reinforces that perimeter. The rowanwood disrupts the mirror's connection to its realm. And the final seal, a Jinfaxi rune, must be drawn in a single, unbroken line, closing the circuit. He looked at her, his expression deadly serious. Once you begin the ritual, you must not stop. She will feel what you are doing. She will react. She will throw everything she has at you. Illusions, voices, fear. She will use it all to try and make you break the circle. Your amulet will protect your mind, but your will must be your own. You must not falter. The drive back to Havenwood was the surreal inverse of her desperate flight north. The rowan amulet around her neck was a silent comfort, a shield that kept the whispers and the psychic pressure at bay. The world looked normal again. The paranoia had receded, but it was the normality that felt like a lie. She was driving through a world of sleeping people who had no idea that their reality was a thin veil, easily torn by things that lurked in the cold and the dark. She was no longer a fugitive running from a monster. She was a warden, a hunter, returning to cage a beast. They arrived on the outskirts of Havenwood well after midnight, parking in a dark, quiet street a few blocks from the library. The town she had known her whole life looked alien, its familiar storefronts and houses like a stage set for a play that had long since ended. Are you ready? Finch asked, his voice a low whisper in the confines of the car. He looked out of his element, a creature of archives and studies thrust into a field operation. No, Helena answered honestly, but it doesn't matter. They moved through the silent streets like shadows. Helena, in her familiar territory, led the way, her staff key feeling heavy and strange in her hand. The lock on the library's grand front door clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire town square. They slipped inside, closing and locking the door behind them. The library was not the same place she had fled. The air was heavy, stagnant, and unnaturally cold. The cheerful, welcoming atmosphere was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that felt like a sleeping predator. Even without her psychic connection, Helena could feel the sheer weight of the mirror's presence saturating the building, a dark stain on the heart of her former sanctuary. Finch shivered, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "Extraordinary," he murmured, his breath misting. "The ambient temperature is at least 20 degrees lower than outside. Its influence is bleeding out, even while it's dormant." They didn't turn on the lights. Using only small, powerful flashlights, they established their positions. Finch would remain on the main floor, a lookout and a guardian for the top of the stairs. He placed his own bag on a reading table, laying out several old, iron objects and a small pouch of salt. He was creating his own small circle of protection. Helena, meanwhile, prepared her own kit. The 4 cold-forged nails, the salt, the rowan twigs, the chalk. She checked the instructions on the parchment one last time, memorizing the shape of the final sealing rune. The time had come. She walked to the heavy oak door leading to the archives, the canvas bag feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. She put her hand on the knob, the cold brass a shock to her system. "Helena." Finch's voice cut through the darkness. She turned to look at him. He stood 20 feet away, a grim, determined shadow in the gloom. Vinna saw himself as the mirror's victim. "Hel wants you to believe you are the same," the old scholar said, his voice ringing with conviction. "But the power to ward, to seal, to contain, that is not the power of a victim. It is the power of a warden. Remember who you are in this equation." He paused, and a rare, thin smile touched his lips. "Remember, you are not the one being haunted anymore. You are the one doing the hunting." His words settled in her heart, a core of strength and purpose. He was right. She took a deep, steadying breath, turned the knob, and pulled open the door. The familiar, profound cold of the archives washed over her like a physical wave. She looked down into the waiting darkness, and then, without hesitation, she began to descend. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs was a living thing. It was thick, heavy, and achingly cold. The amulet around Helena's neck pulsed with a steady, reassuring warmth, a tiny island of life in an ocean of oppressive dread. The beam of her flashlight cut a swath through the gloom, falling upon the Hellspiel. It stood against the far wall, silent and waiting. It no longer looked like a simple object. It looked like a wound in the world, a place where the fabric of reality had been worn thin, threatening to tear. Remembering Finch's words, "You are the hunter now," Helena pushed down her fear and walked forward, her footsteps unnaturally loud on the concrete floor. She knelt and opened the canvas bag, laying out the tools of her gambit. The 4 crude, black nails of cold-forged iron, the pouch of sea salt, the bundle of rowan twigs, and the chalk. She picked up the first nail. As her fingers closed around it, the surface of the mirror rippled, shifting from a dark reflection to a swirling gray mist. A voice, smooth and resonant, echoed from the glass itself, speaking not to her mind, but into the air of the room. "Warden," the voice of Hel purred. "A new title for an old soul. You wear it with such defiance. But you do not want to do this. You are merely playing a part for the old man upstairs. Put down his trinkets. I can give you a real title. I can give you a real kingdom." Helena ignored the voice, her focus absolute. She went to the bottom right corner of the mirror, paced out 2 feet, and drove the first iron nail into the dusty wooden floorboards with a small hammer from the kit. The moment the iron bit into the wood, a low, guttural hiss erupted from the mirror. A tremor shook the floor beneath her knees. The oppressive pressure in the corner where she knelt lessened, as if a leak had been partially plugged. One anchor was set. She moved to the bottom left corner, the second nail in hand. The voice from the mirror sharpened, losing its persuasive tone. "You think these old ways can bind a goddess? This is the refuge of frightened men, clinging to dying embers of belief." As she raised the hammer, the reflection in the mirror changed. It showed her a memory she hadn't revisited in years, herself as a child, sitting alone in the school library during recess, watching the other children play outside through the window, a profound sense of separateness already settling into her heart. "You have always been one of mine, Helena," the voice whispered, full of false sympathy. "You have always been destined for the quiet places. Why fight it?" "Because I choose to." Helena gritted out and brought the hammer down. Crack. The second nail went in. The hiss from the mirror became a low growl. The books on the shelves nearest to her rattled violently. 2 anchors were set. She moved to the top left corner, the third nail ready. The assault escalated. The rattling of the books became a storm. One after another, heavy, leather-bound volumes launched themselves from the shelves, cutting through the air like cannonballs. Helena ducked and shielded her head as a century-old encyclopedia shattered against the wall behind her. The air filled with flying paper and the stench of decay. "I am the master of the silent dead," the voice roared, the room shaking with its fury. "These forgotten stories are my subjects. They will bury you." Through the chaos, Helena scrambled to the third point and drove the nail home. Crack. A wave of force blasted out from the mirror, throwing her back. She landed hard. The air knocked from her lungs, but the nail was in. 3 anchors. The storm of books began to subside, their energy now confined within the invisible perimeter she had created. Only one remained. As she staggered to her feet and moved to the final corner, the mirror played its most cruel trick. The reflection cleared to show the main floor of the library upstairs. It showed Dr. Finch, his back to the viewer, standing at his table of wards. Then, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room, a tall, gaunt shape that moved with an unnatural speed. It was the shape of Hel herself, a specter of death and sorrow. The vision showed the figure raising a shadowy hand to Finch's back. "The old man is weak, Warden," the voice whispered, a note of triumph in its tone. "He cannot protect himself. Abandon this foolishness, and I may let him serve you in my kingdom." Helena's heart seized with terror, but then she saw it. In the reflection, Finch's hand was resting on a piece of cold iron on his table, and the shadow figure of Hel kept its distance, unable to get close. It was a lie, a desperate, final illusion. "He is not alone," she shouted, and with a final, defiant cry, she hammered the 4th nail into place. The moment the last anchor was set, a deep, resonant hum filled the room. The chaotic energy was now fully contained within the iron square. Helena quickly moved along the perimeter, pouring a thick, unbroken line of salt, connecting the 4 nails. Then, she placed a rowan twig across each nail head. The barrier was complete. Now for the lock. She took the chalk, its texture gritty under her fingers. She moved to the center of the perimeter, directly before the mirror. The surface of the glass was now a maelstrom of furious, gray energy. The full, unrestrained power of the goddess was beating against the inside of the invisible cage. Helena took a deep breath and began to draw the Jinfaxi rune on the floor, a complex symbol of control and victory. As the chalk touched the floor, the mirror flared with a blinding, white-cold light. The voice of Hel was no longer a whisper or a roar. It was an apocalyptic scream of pure rage that vibrated in Helena's very bones. A physical force, like a hurricane, pushed against her, trying to throw her back, to make her break the line. "You cannot cage me, mortal. I am the end of all things." With every ounce of her will, Helena pushed back, her arms shaking as she slowly, deliberately, completed the rune. The world seemed to fade to a battle of wills between a librarian and a goddess. Finally, her hand shaking, she drew the last curve, connecting the line back to its beginning. The instant the rune was complete, a brilliant silver light erupted from the chalk line on the floor. The furious, white light of the mirror was silenced, sucked back into the glass as if drawn into a vortex. The world-shaking scream was cut off. The pressure vanished. And then there was only silence. Helena collapsed backward, panting and exhausted, her muscles aching. She looked up. The flying debris lay scattered across the floor. The air was still and calm. The profound, supernatural cold was gone, replaced by the simple, musty dampness of a basement. She looked at the mirror. It was just a mirror, an old, tarnished, dusty antique, its surface reflecting the dim, messy archives around her. The ward was complete. The seal was set. She let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. They had done it. They had won. But as she watched, her eyes fixed on the gleaming silver rune on the floor, she saw something that made her blood run cold again. On the perfectly drawn line of the Jinfaxi rune, near the northernmost point, a tiny, almost invisible hairline crack appeared, a dark fracture in the silver light. The seal was holding, but it was already under strain. The clock was ticking. The silence in the aftermath of the ritual was more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a battle won, of a force repelled. Helena lay on the cold floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, her gaze fixed on the glowing silver rune she had drawn. It pulsed with a soft, steady light, a sigil of defiance in the heart of the library's darkness. Heavy, deliberate footsteps sounded on the stairs, and a moment later, Dr. Finch appeared, an oil lamp held high. He took in the scene, the scattered, broken books, the exhausted but living Helena, and the now inert mirror, and a look of profound, academic awe spread across his face. "My word," he breathed, stepping carefully into the room. He knelt beside the rune, his eyes tracing its form. The energy release was palpable, even upstairs. It was like a psychic thunderclap. His gaze fell upon the tiny, dark fracture in the silver line. "Ah," he said softly, a note of concern in his voice. "As I feared." Helena pushed herself into a sitting position. "What is it? Did I do it wrong?" "No, my dear girl. You did it perfectly," Finch said, his respect for her evident in his tone. "This is not a failure of the ward. This is a testament to the sheer power you have managed to contain. She is already pressing against the bars of her cage. The seal is holding, but it is under immense, constant strain." He looked at her, his expression grim. "The clock is now ticking. I would estimate we have weeks, perhaps a month at most, before the seal shatters." There was no time to rest on their victory. They ascended from the archives, sealing the heavy oak door behind them. Leaving the basement felt like closing a tomb. They didn't speak as they exited the library, locking the door and melting back into the pre-dawn shadows of Havenwood. This departure felt different from her last. She wasn't fleeing a monster anymore. She was a warden, leaving her post to embark on a vital mission. She took one last look at the building that had been the center of her small, quiet world, and felt a pang of sorrow not for the life she had lost, but for the peaceful ignorance she could never reclaim. The journey back to Vermont was dedicated to logistics. The fantastical quest for a mythological lock had to be built on a foundation of mundane, real-world planning. A transatlantic flight is a non-starter, Finch stated as they drove, the rising sun casting long shadows across the highway. "But I have a contingency." An old friend from my university days left academia to run a small, independent shipping company. He owes me a rather significant favor involving a misplaced manuscript and a very angry auction house. Upon arriving back at his sanctuary, Finch made a call on an old, rotary dial telephone that was connected to a landline. The conversation was brief and cryptic, full of vague references to sensitive cargo, and two researchers needing quiet passage. When he hung up, it was settled. He had secured them 2 berths on a container ship, the North Star, leaving from the port of Boston in 3 days' time. Its destination, Bergen, Norway. While Finch arranged their passage, Helena had her own ghosts to attend to. She sat at his kitchen table and, using his laptop, typed out a simple, formal resignation email to the Havenwood Library Board. She then logged into her online banking, transferring the majority of her life savings to a new account, and arranged a series of cash withdrawals. She was systematically dismantling her old life, piece by piece, turning assets into untraceable funds for the journey ahead. Each click of the mouse felt like a final goodbye. As they spent the next 2 days preparing, packing Finch's essential research books and Helena's practical, durable clothing, a strange sense of foreboding began to gather around the house. The amulet kept Hel's direct influence at bay, but it was as if the natural world itself was aware of their plans. On the final morning, as they loaded their bags into Finch's sturdy old station wagon, Helena noticed the trees surrounding the property were filled with crows. Not a handful, but hundreds. They sat on the branches in absolute silence, a vast, dark congregation of obsidian eyes, all watching the house. "Crows," Finch murmured, following her gaze. "Not Odin's ravens of thought and memory. Crows are watchers, scavengers, psychopomps. They are creatures of the borderlands between life and death. She knows we're on the move. She can't touch you, but she can watch." The drive to the port of Boston was a quiet, sober affair. The city's industrial waterfront was a world away from Finch's quiet study and Helena's silent library. Here, everything was noise, motion, and the overwhelming smell of salt and diesel fuel. Cranes like giant, skeletal beasts moved containers in a slow, ponderous ballet. It was a place of transitions, a gateway to the rest of the world. Their ship, the North Star, was a hulking, utilitarian vessel, its hull streaked with rust, its purpose work, not comfort. They were shown to a small, Spartan cabin with 2 simple bunks. It was functional, clean, and most importantly, it had no mirrors, only a small, porthole window looking out at the sea. As evening fell, a deep, resonant horn blast echoed across the harbor. There was a low shudder as the ship's powerful engines engaged. Helena and Finch stood on a small, windswept deck, watching the lights of Boston twinkle and then slowly recede. The land that had been her entire world grew smaller and smaller until it was just a faint glow on the horizon, finally swallowed by the immense darkness of the sea. Helena instinctively touched the Rowan amulet at her neck. It was warm against her skin. The seal was holding behind them, a fragile dam against a tide of ancient power. Ahead of them lay the vast, dark, and cold Atlantic. They were sailing toward the old world, toward the source of the curse, with nothing but a handful of clues and a ticking clock. The journey had truly begun. Life aboard the North Star was a study in monotony. The world shrank to the dimensions of the hulking container ship, the vibrating steel decks, the Spartan cabin, the small mess hall, and the endless, churning expanse of the gray Atlantic. The constant, deep-throated thrum of the ship's engines became the rhythm of their new reality, a ceaseless hum that vibrated through their bones day and night. The crew was a small, international skeleton force who kept to themselves, their faces weathered by the sea, and their conversations brief and functional. For Helena, this isolation was a strange and welcome reprieve. With the Rowan amulet a constant, warm presence against her skin, and the Hellspiel an ocean away, the crushing mental weight of Hel's presence was gone. The silence in her own mind was a balm. She could think clearly, breathe deeply, and sleep without the dread of waking up in a cold, gray cavern. It was a fragile peace, the quiet of a battlefield between engagements, but she cherished every moment of it. They spent their days turning their small cabin into a mobile research office. Dr. Finch had, with remarkable foresight, packed a small sea chest filled with what he deemed essential texts. While the ship plowed eastward, they hunched over Vinta's journal, cross-referencing its frantic passages with ancient maps of Norway and scholarly books on runic traditions and Norse burial rites. Her power is in her realm, Finch explained one afternoon, his finger tracing a diagram of the 9 worlds. The mirror is her window, her embassy. The seal we placed on it is like boarding up the windows and locking the doors of that embassy. It stops her from looking out or sending agents through. But the embassy itself still stands on our soil. What we must find in Solvern is the diplomatic equivalent of revoking her charter, the ritual or object that deconsecrates the land, permanently severing the connection. Under Finch's tutelage, Helena's role began to shift. She was no longer just a victim or a witness. She was becoming a student and apprentice. She absorbed the knowledge Finch offered, her librarian's mind adept at categorizing the complex genealogies of the Norse gods and the subtle distinctions between different runic alphabets. Your memory is your greatest weapon now, Finch told her, quizzing her on the shapes and meanings of protective wards. Should you ever find yourself without your amulet, these symbols, drawn with intent, can offer a sliver of protection. They are the language of the old world. You must learn to speak it. She practiced drawing them on a notepad until she could form them perfectly from memory, the sharp, angular lines feeling strangely powerful under her pen. She was arming herself, not with iron, but with knowledge. But as they drew further out into the vast, empty heart of the ocean, it became clear that while they might be shielded, they were not hidden. Hel's influence, unable to touch Helena directly, began to poison the world around them. A strange, unnatural fog descended upon the ship on their 4th day at sea. It was a thick, clammy, and utterly silent fog that swallowed the sun and reduced visibility to a few dozen feet. It did not lift for the next 3 days. The crew grew tense and sullen, their faces drawn and pale. Arguments broke out in the mess hall over minor things. The ship's captain, a stoic Norwegian named Lars, cursed the fog, saying he'd never seen one so persistent in 30 years at sea. The crew began to complain of nightmares. They spoke of dreaming of a vast, silent, gray land. One young deckhand from the Philippines swore he kept hearing a woman whispering his name on the wind, even over the roar of the engines. Helena and Finch knew the truth. Hel was projecting her realm's oppressive aura, turning the ship into a small, floating piece of Helheim, trying to isolate and demoralize its inhabitants. Then came the omens. One morning, a sailor cried out from the bow. The sea ahead, as far as the eye could see through the fog, was covered with dead fish, their white bellies turned up to the sky in a vast, floating graveyard. They sailed through the grim spectacle for hours. Another day, an albatross, considered a sign of good luck by sailors, landed on the ship's railing. It seemed exhausted and sick. It stared at Helena with a flat, black eye, let out a single, harsh croak, and then fell dead onto the deck. The atmosphere on the ship grew heavy with a sense of impending doom. The crew began to avoid Helena and Finch, sensing, on some primal level, that the strange weather and ill omens were connected to the two quiet, bookish passengers. The climax came on their last night before they were due to make landfall in Norway. The fog was thicker than ever, and a cold, biting rain was falling. Helena was in her bunk, trying to read, when the ship's emergency alarm suddenly blared, a jarring, panicked sound. She and Finch hurried out onto the deck. One of the crewmen, a burly Russian engineer named Sasha, was standing near the stern, his face as white as a sheet, his eyes wide with terror. He was pointing a shaking finger out into the churning, black water. "A woman," he shouted at the captain, his voice cracking. There was a woman in the water, floating right alongside us. The captain shone a powerful spotlight into the waves, but there was nothing there but rain and sea spray. "You are drunk, Sasha," the captain yelled over the wind. "Go below."
No.
"I saw her," Sasha insisted, grabbing the captain's arm. She was pale, with black hair. One side of her face, Virginia, a goddess. The other side, Cherub, a skull. Helena's blood ran cold. Finch put a steadying hand on her shoulder. The captain dismissed the man as delirious, ordering him to his quarters. But Helena knew he wasn't crazy. She walked to the railing, peering into the inky blackness where the spotlight now showed nothing. The amulet around her neck was warm, a shield against the direct cold of the goddess's presence. But she could feel it now, an immense, ancient, and patient awareness, waiting for them across the water. Hel was no longer just a distant threat confined to a mirror. She knew they were coming. She was on the other side of the ocean, and she was waiting. Helena looked out at the dark horizon, toward the unseen coast of Norway. This wasn't an escape. This was an appointment. The coast of Norway did not appear all at once, but emerged from the persistent gray fog in pieces. The dark, jagged peak of a mountain, a flash of green from a distant, forested slope, and finally, the deep, dark blue of the fjord. After the featureless eternity of the Atlantic, the sight of land was a shock to the system. This was not the familiar, welcoming coast of New England. This was something older, wilder, and more profound. The mountains rose like giants from the sea, their slopes scarred by ancient glaciers, their peaks shrouded in mist. As the North Star navigated the narrow channel toward the port of Bergen, the city revealed itself. It was a kaleidoscope of color and history, with the iconic, brightly painted wooden houses of the Briggen Wharf lining the harbor, a stark contrast to the brooding mountains that cradled the city. For the first time, Helena felt the true weight of history. This was the old world, a land that had been shaped by the myths and monsters she was now fighting. The moment she stepped onto the solid ground of the dock, the feeling began. It was a subtle, prickling sensation, like the static electricity in the air before a storm. The sense of being watched. Her amulet was still warm against her skin, a shield against any direct assault. But here, Hel's influence was not an invasive force. It was the very atmosphere. It was in the unnervingly intelligent gaze of a raven perched on a gabled roof, in the shadows that clung to the narrow, cobblestone alleyways, and in the faces of the people who, while polite, seemed to possess a deep, ancestral gravity. "She is woven into this place," Finch murmured, his eyes scanning their surroundings as they walked. "Her essence is part of the soil, part of the story of this land. We must be vigilant." Their first task was to secure transport. Finch, ever the meticulous planner, led them to a small, independent car rental agency far from the polished glass and reflective surfaces of the main airport. They rented a sturdy, unassuming station wagon, paying in cash and relying on a detailed paper map. The familiar ritual of disconnecting from the modern world felt more important here than ever. The drive inland from Bergen was a journey into a myth. The roads twisted and turned, clinging to the sides of mountains and plunging into long, dark tunnels that felt like passages into another world. To their left, the deep, dark waters of the Sone of George stretched out like a vast, sleeping serpent. To their right, sheer rock faces rose for thousands of feet, streaked with waterfalls that looked like silver threads against the black stone. Finch, who had studied this land his entire life, provided a running commentary that was both academic and chilling. That peak there, he'd say, pointing to a mist-wreathed summit, was said to be one of the homes of the Jotun, the frost giants. And the water in this fjord is so deep, so cold, that the old sagas claimed its bottom was a direct path to Niflheim, the primordial world of ice and fog. He wasn't just quoting folklore, he was identifying features of the enemy's territory. As the hours passed and they drove deeper into the heart of the fjordlands, the signs of modern life grew scarcer. The villages became smaller and more isolated, clusters of simple, sturdy houses clinging to the water's edge. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the colossal mountains, they saw a simple wooden sign, Solvern. The village was breathtakingly beautiful and achingly ancient. It was a tiny hamlet of white wooden houses and a single, historic hotel, all nestled in a quiet cove on the fjord. Dominating the hillside above the village was the dark, dragon-like shape of a staved church, its timber blackened by 800 years of wind and rain. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the cry of a seabird and the gentle lapping of the fjord against the shore. They checked into the Wallaker Hotel, a place that had been in operation since the 1600s. Their room was simple, with creaking floorboards and a window that looked out over the deep, placid water. After stowing their gear, they sat with the journal and the map spread out on an old wooden table. They were here at the pin on the map, but they still didn't know where the Winter State was. That evening, they went down to the hotel's small, cozy dining room. The innkeeper, a stout man in his 60s with a kind face and watchful eyes, brought them their meal. Finch, in his carefully practiced academic Norwegian, made polite conversation before steering it toward local history. "We are researchers," Finch explained, "studying the history of families who emigrated from this region in the late 19th century. We've been trying to track the history of a family named Winter." The moment the name was spoken, a subtle change came over the innkeeper. The warm, professional smile faded from his face, replaced by a guarded, somber expression. He placed their plates on the table with a quiet thud. "Winter," he said, his voice low. He glanced around the nearly empty dining room before leaning in slightly. "That is not a name spoken often here. An old family. A strange family. They kept to themselves. The last of them left a long, long time ago. We heard they had a homestead, an estate, somewhere nearby," Helena said, her heart beginning to pound. The innkeeper's gaze drifted to the window, which looked out at the dark, forested ridge that loomed over the village like a breaking wave. "The Vinna place is not a homestead," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is a ruin, on the high ridge, overlooking the fjord. It has been empty for over 100 years. People here say it is a place of bad luck, of sorrow." He paused, his eyes meeting theirs, and in them, Helena saw a deep, inherited fear. "Some places are best left to the quiet dead. You will find the start of the old path a mile north of the village, marked by 2 standing stones." He gave them a curt, final nod and retreated to the kitchen, leaving them with their meal and his chilling, cryptic warning. Later that night, Helena stood at her window, looking out. The moon was a sliver of silver, casting a faint, ethereal light on the fjord surface. Her gaze drifted upward, past the ancient church, to the black, menacing silhouette of the high ridge. It stood against the night sky, a place of secrets and sorrow. Their destination was up there, in the darkness, and it was waiting for them. The morning broke cold and clear, the early sun glinting off the vast, placid surface of the fjord. There was no sense of peace in the beauty, only a stark, intimidating clarity. After a meager breakfast of bread and cheese, eaten in tense silence, Helena and Finch packed a small, sturdy canvas bag with their supplies: water, a compass, flashlights, Vinta's journal, and a small pouch of iron nails and salt, just in case. They found the path exactly where the innkeeper had said it would be, a mile north of the village. 2 weathered, moss-covered stones, no taller than a man, stood like silent sentinels on either side of a barely there trail that led steeply up the forested ridge. The air grew colder as they ascended, the path choked with tangled roots and slick with damp leaves. It was a challenging, breathless climb, a physical pilgrimage that mirrored the difficulty of their quest. After nearly 2 hours of strenuous hiking, the dense forest suddenly gave way to a windswept clearing on the crest of the ridge. And there it was, the Winter Estate. It was not a grand house, but the skeletal remains of a great Norse longhouse. A long, rectangular foundation of massive, dark stones, now crumbling and half swallowed by the earth, marked where the hall had once stood. A single, colossal hearthstone, blackened by centuries of ancient fires, sat in the center like a sacrificial altar. The location was breathtaking, offering a panoramic view of the fjord and the mountains beyond. It was a place of immense power and profound, soul-crushing melancholy. The sorrow of generations seemed to be soaked into the very stones. "My God," Finch breathed, his scholar's reverence mixing with a palpable sense of dread. "This is a place of great significance, a nexus." Even with the amulet a warm weight on her chest, Helena could feel the echoes of the place. It wasn't the active, malevolent presence of Hel, but the deep, psychic stains of the past. As a cold wind swept across the ridge, she heard the faint, ghostly sound of a mournful chant. She saw a flicker in her peripheral vision, a tall, somber-faced man in old-fashioned clothing, standing by the hearth before vanishing like smoke. These were the memories of the land itself. They began their search, moving through the ruins with a quiet purpose. Finch examined the foundation stones, running his hands over them, searching for inscriptions or hidden markers. Helena, trusting her intuition, found herself drawn to the great central hearth. It felt like the heart of the ruin, the place where the family's power and their curse had been centered. "Finch," she called out, her voice soft.
Here.
She knelt by the massive hearthstone. Running her hands along its base, her fingers found an unnatural seam where the great stone met the packed earth floor. Using a small pry bar from their kit, they worked together, leveraging the ancient stone. With a deep groan of protest, a section of the hearthstone tilted upwards, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath it. Inside the hidden compartment, nestled on a bed of rotted, black wool, was a small, iron-bound chest, its wood a dark, petrified oak. It was sealed not with a lock, but with bands of rust-red bog iron. With trembling hands, they lifted it out. It was heavy, solid, and humming with a faint, latent energy. After several minutes of effort, they managed to pry the iron bands loose. The contents were not what Helena had expected. There was no gleaming sword or mystical gem. Instead, there were two objects. The first was a small, heavy piece of metal, cool to the touch. It was forged from dark bog iron into the shape of a complex, seven-pointed knot. Runes were deeply etched into each of its twisted arms. It was not beautiful, but it radiated a sense of immense, contained power. "It is not a key," Finch whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement as he examined it. "It is a hurya, a ritual harrow. In the old rites, a harrow was not a tool of creation, but of unmaking. It was used to break curses, to unravel enchantments, to tear apart the very fabric of a magical working. This was their weapon. Beneath the harrow lay the second object, another journal. It was far older than Elias Vinton's, its leather cover cracked and brittle, its pages a dark, vellum-like parchment covered in the sharp, angular script of Old Norse. This was the ancestral record, the Warden's Journal. Finch took the book with the reverence of a priest handling a holy text. He opened it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration as he began to translate the ancient, faded script. "It speaks of the Vinter bloodline," he murmured, his finger tracing the lines. "Chosen by an ancient pact to be the wardens of a tear in the veil. They created the Hellspiel not as a gift, but as a focusing lens, a way to manage the tear, to keep the influence of Niflheim from bleeding into the world unchecked." He flipped through the brittle pages, his breathing growing shallow. "It describes their duty, their sorrow, their isolation. It is a history of sacrifice." He paused, his finger stopping on a page near the end of the book. The page was different. It was a diagram showing the harrow, the mirror, and a series of complex runic incantations. It was the instructions for the final sealing, the permanent lock. "Here," he said, his voice a strained whisper, "the ritual of unmaking." Helena leaned in, her heart pounding, as Finch began to translate the final passage. "To permanently sever a gate to the realm of the dead," he read, his voice faltering. "The energies that bind it must be unmade by the warden to whom the gate is attuned. With the harrow, the warden must channel their own will, their own life force, into the Hellspiel, tearing its magical threads asunder." He stopped, his face ashen. He looked up from the book, his eyes filled with a horror so profound that Helena felt her own blood turn to ice before he even spoke the final words. "What is it?" she whispered. "What's the cost?" Finch swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he read the last, terrible sentence from the ancient text. But the unmaking creates a vacuum, a void that must be filled. To seal the gate forever, a living soul must be willingly given in exchange, its essence becoming the eternal, unbreakable lock. The ritual does not end until the warden's heart is silent. He looked at Helena, the unspoken truth hanging in the cold mountain air between them. The price for locking the gate, the price for saving her world from the Queen of the Dead, was her own life. The wind on the high ridge held a mournful, ancient song, but Helena heard nothing. The world had gone silent, compressed into the final, terrible sentence Dr. Finch had read aloud. The ritual does not end until the warden's heart is silent. A sacrifice, not of an animal, not of an object, but of a life. Her life. The words did not land with a fiery crash, but with a cold, heavy finality, like a stone settling on the bottom of a deep, dark lake. All the running, all the research, all the small victories had led them here, to an elegant and absolutely inescapable trap. She was the key, and the price of turning the lock was everything she was. No, Finch said, the word a harsh crack in the silence. His academic composure had shattered, replaced by a raw, visceral horror.
No.
Absolutely not. There is a misinterpretation, a missing page, a loophole. He snatched up the ancient journal, his hands shaking, his eyes scanning the brittle pages with a desperate, frantic energy. He was no longer a scholar deciphering a text. He was a man trying to claw his way out of a tomb that had just been sealed. The language is archaic, he muttered, pacing back and forth in the ruin. There could be a double meaning, an allegorical component. The warden's heart is silent could mean a metaphorical silence, a release from the burden. It must, but Helena knew he was wrong. As she watched the kind, brilliant man who had become her only friend unravel in his desperate attempt to save her, a strange, profound calm began to settle over her. She looked at her hands, then out at the breathtaking vista of the fjord below. She thought of her life back in Havenwood, the quiet, ordered, and meticulously lonely life of a librarian. A life spent curating the stories of others. A life of quiet desperation, of feeling like a ghost long before she had ever seen one. What, exactly, was she fighting to return to? As she stood there, caught in the grip of this terrible choice, she felt a faint, cold tendril of awareness brush against the edge of her mind, a subtle wisp of power that momentarily bypassed the amulet's protection. It was a whisper from across the world, a projection from the caged goddess in the library basement. The thought was not in words, but in a feeling, a vision of an endless, gray, silent eternity as the Queen of the Dead. It was a reminder of the alternative, an eternity of cold, conscious loneliness, or a final, meaningful silence. Suddenly, the choice seemed less like a choice. She walked over to where the iron harrow and the warden's journal lay on the ground. She picked up the harrow. The dark, cold metal felt heavy and solid in her hand, its purpose clear and undeniable. This was not a tool of study. It was a tool of ending. She then picked up the journal, holding the history of the Vinta family's sorrow and sacrifice. She was just the final chapter in their long, sad story. "Alistair," she said, her voice so calm and steady it startled them both. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his face a mask of anguish. "Stop," she said gently. "There's no loophole. We both know it. You've known it from the moment you read it." "Helena, I will not accept this," he pleaded. "I brought you into this. I will not lead you to your death." "You didn't lead me here," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Hel did. And this is the only way out. Not just for me, but for everyone. Can you imagine what would happen if that seal breaks? If she finds another person? Or if she finally convinces me to accept her offer?" She held up the harrow. "This is the only way to end it. To lock the gate for good." He looked from her face to the grim, iron tool in her hand, and the frantic energy seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a wave of crushing despair. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm. "You told me a warden's power isn't the power of a victim. It's the power to seal, to contain. You were right. This," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is what the warden does." It was a choice made not in fear or desperation, but with a solemn, chilling clarity. Her old life had been a slow, quiet fading. This was a chance to burn out with a purpose, to make her one small life a permanent, unbreakable shield. The new, final plan settled between them unspoken. Their quest for answers was over. All that remained was the grim journey home. They packed the harrow and the journal in the canvas bag and began their descent from the ridge. The beautiful, panoramic view of the fjord no longer seemed majestic. It seemed like a farewell. The sun was beginning its slow arc toward the massive peaks in the west, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Helena stopped and watched it, truly watched it, committing the sight of the clouds, the light on the water, the shape of the mountains to memory. She was seeing one of her last sunsets. The choice was made. The path was clear. And as they walked back toward the village in the fading light, Helena felt not terror, but a strange and profound sense of peace. The story of her life finally had an ending. Their departure from Solvern was a quiet, somber affair. The kind-eyed innkeeper watched them leave, a look of profound, unspoken pity on his face. He did not wish them well or ask about their research. He simply gave a slow, solemn nod, as if he understood that they were not researchers, but pilgrims returning from a terrible oracle. The drive back to Bergen was silent. The majestic fjords and towering mountains no longer seemed beautiful or intimidating. They simply were. They were ancient, enduring witnesses to the small, fleeting tragedy of a human life. Helena watched the landscape pass by with a detached, serene calm. She was no longer a part of this world in the same way. She was already beginning to let it go. The voyage back across the Atlantic on a different cargo ship was the funereal inverse of their journey out. The first crossing had been a tense, desperate flight toward an unknown answer. This was a slow, inexorable march toward a known and terrible fate. The rhythmic thrum of the engines was no longer a sound of progress, but the ticking of a clock. Each day was a page torn from the final, dwindling chapter of her life. The dynamic between Helena and Finch had been irrevocably altered. The old scholar was consumed by a quiet, gnawing grief. He, who had dedicated his life to uncovering the world's most dangerous secrets, had found the ultimate secret, and in doing so, had condemned the person he had sworn to protect. He would sit for hours, staring out at the gray, endless ocean, the vintage journals lying unread beside him. He had failed, in his mind, and the weight of that failure was crushing him. It was Helena who became the source of strength. Having made her choice, she was unshackled from the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her. A profound, unshakable peace had settled over her. She was no longer the frightened librarian, but the warden, and it was her duty to see this through to the end. "You mustn't blame yourself, Alistair," she said one evening, as they sat in the ship's mess hall. "How can I not?" he replied, his voice thick with sorrow. "My quest for knowledge led you to this. It's a curse." "No," Helena said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's an answer. It's the only answer there is. You didn't give me a death sentence. You gave my life a purpose. There's a difference." She took the ancient warden's journal and opened it to the final pages. "There is one last thing you must teach me," she said. "The words. I must know them by heart." And so, their final lessons began. In the heart of the vast, empty ocean, Alistair Finch, his voice often breaking with grief, taught Helena the old Norse incantation for the ritual of unmaking. She repeated the guttural, powerful words over and over, their rhythms and cadences becoming as familiar as her own name. She was not just memorizing a spell, she was learning her own eulogy. One afternoon, as she recited the ancient words, she stopped and looked at him. "After it's done," she said, "I have one last request." He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "I want you to tell the story," she said. "Use these journals. Write it all down. The story of the Winters, their centuries of sacrifice. And my story. Don't let us be forgotten. Don't let it all have been for nothing." She smiled, a sad, small smile. "It's what we librarians do, after all. We make sure the stories survive." He could only nod, unable to speak, as he took on the final burden she had given him, the burden of the storyteller. He would be the one to remember. As they neared the American coast, the seal on the mirror, an ocean away, began to weaken. Helena felt it. It was a faint flicker against her amulet, a distant echo of the cold. A single, seductive whisper found its way into the edges of her thoughts, a final, desperate offer from the caged goddess. "It is not too late, Warden. An eternity of power. Not the cold, silent nothingness of your choice." Helena paused, looking out at the water. She considered the offer, the endless, lonely silence of Helheim versus the absolute, final silence of oblivion. She found the latter to be a comfort. I prefer the quiet, she whispered to the wind, and the presence receded, finally understanding that her will was absolute. The ship docked in a small, industrial port in Maine under a sky the color of slate. The familiar sight of the American coastline held no comfort. It looked like a foreign country, a place she was only visiting briefly before a much longer journey. They hired a car, paying in cash, and began the last leg of their journey, the final drive south. Hours later, as twilight began to bleed across the sky, they saw it. A simple, green and white sign on the side of the highway. Havenwood, 5 miles. Helena stared at the sign as they passed. The name of the town that had once been her entire world. The place where her quiet, ordinary life had ended. The place where it would now find its extraordinary, final meaning. The journey was over. The sacrifice was at hand. The Havenwood Library stood silent and dark, a grand, Gothic tomb under the faint light of a crescent moon. A bone-deep cold radiated from its stone walls, a palpable aura of dread that seeped into the quiet town square. The temporary seal was failing. Hell was stirring. They stood before the grand oak doors, the end of their long, impossible journey. Before they entered, Finch stopped Helena. He wordlessly handed her the ancestral warden's journal and a simple fountain pen. "The story is not quite finished," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "The last entry is for the final warden to write." Helena took the book. Leaning against the cold stone of the library, she opened it to the first blank page. Her handwriting, the neat, precise script of a librarian, was steady. She wrote only a few lines. "My name is Helena. I was a librarian. I lived a quiet life among stories. Now my own story is at its end. I do this not out of fear, but out of choice. I was asked to be a queen. I have chosen to be a lock. May the silence I leave behind be a peaceful one." She closed the book and handed it back to Finch, a silent transfer of duty.
He was the storyteller now.
She was the story. They entered the library. The cold was a physical blow. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the grave. They descended the stairs to the archives together, and the sight that met them stole their breath. The silver Genfaxi rune on the floor was now a fractured, dying thing. Its light sputtered and pulsed weakly. The crack Helena had seen now a gaping chasm across its center. From the crack, a thick, gray mist, cold as the void, seeped out, coiling across the floor. The mirror was no longer a reflection. It was an open wound, a swirling vortex of the mists of Helheim. The low, sorrowful moan of 1,000 lost souls echoed from its depths. There was no more time. "Alistair," Helena said, turning to him at the bottom of the stairs. "Thank you for everything." "It was the greatest honor of my life to have known you, Helena," he whispered, his face a mask of grief and awe. He could go no further. This final path was hers alone to walk. Helena turned and walked into the center of the failing ward, the cold mist swirling around her ankles. She pulled the iron harrow from her bag. It felt impossibly heavy, a cold anchor of purpose in her hand. The amulet on her chest burned with a protective warmth, a final shield for her soul. She faced the mirror. The mists within it parted, and the face of Hel appeared, clearer and more real than ever before. Her beauty was heartbreaking, her decay terrifying. She looked not with rage, but with a profound, cosmic sorrow. "Warden," her voice spoke, not with a roar, but with the soft intimacy of a final plea. "Look at what you are choosing. A cold, empty nothingness. An end to all thought, all memory. A final, absolute silence." The image in the mirror shifted. It showed a vision of a silent, majestic throne, and Helena sitting upon it, a crown of black ice on her head, a regal and eternal queen ruling over a silent kingdom. "I offer you an eternity," Hel's voice whispered. "An escape from all pain. A purpose. An end to loneliness. We can be silent together. Do not choose oblivion. Do not leave me alone again." It was the final, most powerful temptation. The promise of an end to being alone. Helena looked at the lonely goddess, a being of immense power trapped for eons in a kingdom of sorrow, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of pity. "All stories must have an ending," Helena said softly, more to herself than to the goddess. "Even the sad ones." Her choice was absolute. She raised the iron harrow. It began to glow, a faint, cold light emanating from within as her own life force, her will, began to channel into it. Then she began to speak. The ancient, guttural words of the ritual of unmaking filled the room. Each word was a hammer blow against the foundation of the gateway. The harrow in her hand flared brighter, the light pouring from it now a brilliant, white fire. The mirror screamed, a sound of tearing fabric and shattering worlds. Cracks of pure energy spread across its surface. The room shook, and a storm of psychic power erupted, throwing Finch back against the stairs. Helena stood firm in the heart of the storm, her voice never faltering, her will a burning, immovable star. She was no longer a librarian. She was a warden, a warrior, a sacrifice. She was a lock being forged. She spoke the final, terrible word of the incantation. Her life force, her very soul, surged into the harrow, turning it into a blinding sun of pure, white light. "Goodbye," she whispered in English. Then, she lunged forward and drove the harrow into the heart of the mirror. There was no sound, only light, a silent, absolute, all-consuming flash of pure, clean white that filled the room, the library, the world. And then it was over. The mirror had disintegrated into a fine, gray dust that settled on the floor. The harrow lay in the center of the dust, dark and inert once more. The psychic storm was gone. The supernatural cold had vanished, replaced by the simple, musty air of a library basement. The wound in the world was healed. At the center of the now faded rune, Helena lay on the floor, her hand resting over her chest. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. Her eyes were closed, as if in sleep. Her heart was silent. Epilogue. 1 year later, Alastair Finch sat in his study in Vermont, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. On his desk lay a newly bound book, its cover simple, dark leather. Its title was The Warden's Heart. Beside it lay 2 old, worn journals. He had fulfilled his final promise. He had told her story. He looked out the window at the peaceful green of the forest. The world was as it had always been. People went about their lives, unaware of the silent war that had been fought, of the librarian who had given her life to keep their reality safe. There were no statues for Helena, no holidays, no monuments. Her monument was the quiet itself, the peaceful, ordinary silence of a world free from the sorrow of a lonely goddess. Alastair picked up his pen and wrote the final dedication on the first page of his book. For Helena, the keeper of stories, who chose to become the final, silent one, so that all of ours could continue.